What's up, everybody, and welcome to HTTP's Digital Inclusion Summit. My name is CJ Johnson, and I'm an award-winning content creator, startup advisor, and I'm here to walk you through some things. Tech and telecommunications policy is the new frontier for civil rights. Today's program is all about diverse communities coming together to raise our voices and engage our communities in these important discussions. We invite you to join the conversation today on Twitter and on Instagram using the hashtag HTTP Inclusion, and by following HTTP on both platforms at HTTP_policy. If you're on Instagram, we also have some awesome stickers. So let me show you how to make all of these work. First, you want to make sure that you have downloaded the Jiffy app on your phone. Fun fact, Jiffy is integrated and powers all of your GIFs on your Facebook, your iPhone, and on Instagram. Now that you have it installed on your phone, head over to Instagram, start an Instagram story just like you normally would. Click on the top kind of square smiley face, then select the GIF button, and then type in HTTP inclusion and you will see all of the stickers. Feel free to spread the word and add them to your Instagram stories. And remember to tag us at HTTP_policy. All right, now you guys are all set. I'll be checking in on you on Twitter and Instagram and reposting some of my favorite posts of the day. Enjoy the program, and I will see you all at the live happy hour immediately following today's program. If you have already signed up, you will receive a link to join soon, and if you haven't already, visit digitalinclusionsummit.org and register to attend. I will see you soon.
Welcome. My name is Brent Wilkes, and I'm the chairman of the Hispanic Telecommunications and Technology Partnership. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our Digital Inclusion Summit, which is our effort to make sure that we talk about issues pertaining to the Latino community and the efforts of HTTP to ensure that we are participants in the digital economy. I'm really excited to tell you a little bit about the history of HTTP because we started many years ago on the belief that it's so important for Latinos to be represented on the policy matters that really deal with digital inclusion, with access to broadband, and with ensuring that Latinos are able to fully participate in the new economy. The reason why we thought this was incredibly important is because at the time that HTTP was started, the Latino community had one of the highest labor force participation rates in the country, still does, and yet the inclusion in the digital economy was lacking. And our concern was that as the country increasingly relies on a digital workforce, it's going to be more and more important for Latinos to be full participants in this economy. And so we wanted to stake out some priorities that would really help Latinos gain access to the internet, to be able to develop the next generation of apps and internet content, and to be full participants in this economy in terms of having positions, ownership positions within companies that are digital companies, but also in the employment base. And so this was really the main focus of HTTP since its beginning. And because it's a broad-based coalition that includes many of the largest Latino organizations in the country, we think we've got a really strong pulse on the needs of the Latino community. So over the years, we've had incredible amounts of success in terms of staking out positions that we consider to be pro-Latino and in support of the Latino community's efforts to get online. And I think now more than ever, the work that we're doing is increasingly important, certainly because of COVID-19 and how it's impacted Latino communities and African-American communities across the country, both in terms of an over-indexing and catching this disease, but also because so many people who find themselves out of work opportunities are in the Latino and African-American communities. And so what we feel is really critically important is that this digital inclusion effort now is more important than ever, especially as we see tech companies grabbing an ever larger share of the economy. we want to make sure that Latinos are fully included in this, in these opportunities that are being created by the tech industry. And for that reason, we think the work that HTTP is doing is extremely important. So really excited that we're kicking off the Digital Inclusion Summit. And I wanted to introduce to you an extraordinary gentleman, Alejandro Rourke, who has been the executive director of HTTP for the past few years and is doing an amazing job helping us to really help position the Latino community on these very important policy matters, but also making sure all of our organizations are part of the effort to help include and ensure that there's diversity within the technology space. So without further ado, please welcome Alejandro Rourke.
Thank you, Brent, and thank you to everyone who has registered and who is tuning in live from across the country. Our inaugural Digital Inclusion Summit is an expression of our organizational values and our collaborative approach to ensuring that as technology continues to transform every aspect of our lives, it isn't also unintentionally embedding the cultural and systemic inequalities of the past. Our goal today is to spark meaningful dialogue about how Latino, Black, rural, and Indigenous communities of color are impacted by the policy decisions that are made both at the corporate level and by Congress, and to use this moment, which is defined by a global health crisis, to establish a baseline of understanding as a springboard towards establishing the people's policy agenda for an inclusive tech future that ensures that every person, regardless of age, gender, ability, race, orientation, zip code, or country of origin, is able to fully participate and benefit from our 21st century economy. For those of you who might not yet be familiar with the work of Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership, HTTP is a CEO roundtable of 16 of the country's oldest and largest Latino civil rights organizations who work in coalition to support the social, political, and economic advancement of over 50 million Americans of Latino descent by facilitating access to high-quality education, economic opportunity, and effective healthcare through the use of technology tools and resources. Today's program features highlights from conversations with digital inclusion advocates, policymakers, regulators, and thought leaders, and shines a light on important blind spots and opportunities in our national tech and telecommunications policy debate. Full versions of these conversations are available right now by visiting httppolicy.org/rewind. Like CJ mentioned, we invite all of you to join the conversation on Twitter and Instagram by liking, sharing, and commenting on these full-length clips using the hashtag HTTPinclusion. As we begin our program, I want to take a moment to recognize our underwriting partners and the leadership of HTTP member organizations and our executive board who are simulcasting this event, and to our mission-aligned partners featured throughout the program for your help in making today's virtual event possible. Thank you all for your support, your ongoing partnership, and thank you all for being here today. We look forward to hearing from each of you, both online and in person, during our live after show immediately following today's simulcast. Welcome, and I hope you enjoy today's program.
This year's been tough, but I don't know, it's given me a lot of time to learn new skills through the internet.
I've been joining more classes during lockdown. I taught myself how to play guitar online.
I'm doing an internship.
I created a small nonprofit foundation.
So when people ask,
how is schoolwork going to be turned in?
how will I continue studying?
How are we going to do this online?
I feel like I'm ready.
I'm ready.
I'm ready for anything.
Hi everyone, Maria Samaniego tuning in from Southern California. Congrats on the first ever Digital Inclusion Summit.
Hello everyone, I'm Deb Haaland, Congresswoman for New Mexico's 1st Congressional District. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to share a few words at Hispanic Tech and Telecom Partnership's Digital Inclusion Summit virtually. HTTP's work to advocate for Hispanic communities has had a tremendous impact on telecommunications and technology policy, and I'm proud to support their efforts to make technological advances available to Hispanic and Latino communities everywhere. This pandemic has put a spotlight on the disparities that exist for Hispanic communities and communities of color across the country. Every community deserves access to emergency services and economic relief during this crisis, But as you all know, communities of color have been left behind in infrastructure development, creating connectivity barriers that lead to elders losing access to telehealth services, children being unable to log in for school, and workers being unable to apply for unemployment benefits. I've heard from families in my district and across the country that internet access is too expensive or completely unavailable to them, or that the FCC hasn't taken their right steps to connect everyone, no matter their background or where they live. That's why I introduced the Broadband for All resolution. This resolution affirms that access to broadband internet is a human right and seeks to unleash broadband internet to everyone during these unprecedented times and beyond. But Native Americans living in their communities have not only been left behind in the digital divide, but as sovereign Native nations, they encounter significant barriers to access spectrum rights on their tribal lands, to deploy wireless broadband to their communities. In July, I introduced the Digital Reservations Act, which will help tribes fully realize self-governance and protect their sovereign right to manage their own natural resources on tribal lands and ensure Native communities aren't stuck in the digital divide. Increasing access to broadband for communities will unlock opportunities, and it's a primary focus of mine as we continue to address this pandemic in a state and national scale. I'm your ally in Congress and look forward to hearing about the innovation and ideas that come out of this summit. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Deborah Haaland, for your service in Congress and for your leadership extending broadband infrastructure to rural and tribal communities who are some of the most historically disconnected members of our community. Digital inclusion has been defined in many ways by many people, but to us at HTTP, digital inclusion is about more than just internet access. We see it as a movement towards new solutions that connect every community and every home to affordable broadband. It's an inclusive movement towards information technologies built by and for diverse communities with diverse needs. And it's about ensuring that everyone is able to obtain the digital skills necessary to stay safe online. Hashtag HTTP inclusion means that no one gets left out or left behind, and everyone is connected. To help paint a clearer picture of what true digital inclusion means to diverse communities and what actions are necessary to achieve our shared goal, I sat down with Maria Town, CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities, John C. Yang, the Executive Director for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and Marco Davis, CEO of CHCI, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. Here are some highlights from those conversations.
My name is Maria Town, and I serve as the President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. Technology has been really central to my life. I will disclose a little bit of my age. I am a millennial, and to talk about the difference that technology can make in the lives of disabled people, I can share a very personal story. So I was born shortly before the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. And this is the landmark transformational piece of civil rights legislation that prohibits discrimination based on disability status. And so I was born with a disability. It was very clear from the moment I arrived that I would go on to live with a disability for the rest of my life. And, the doctors could have told my parents, she won't walk, she won't talk, you probably need to institutionalize her. But instead, they told my parents she probably won't walk, she probably won't talk, but don't worry, there'll be technology. Now, that statement from those physicians set an expectation for my family that I would be able to live in the community, to be educated in a mainstream school, and have a job. Now, admittedly, more than 30 years after the passage after my birth and 30 years after the passage of the ADA, we see that technology has created great opportunities for people with disabilities, again, to access our communities, to advance our civil rights, but we still have a long way to go. As many opportunities as technology has created for people with disabilities, it has also created new barriers that we don't have as many tools to navigate. I'll give you an example. Transit network companies like Uber and Lyft have said that they don't have to follow the Americans with Disabilities Act because they're not transportation companies, they're technology companies. So there are some major gaps around inclusive tech and what we think of as tech and how it relates to the disability community that AAPD is trying to fill. AAPD is a cross-disability civil rights organization, meaning that we fight to advance the rights of all 61 million people with disabilities across the United States. Disability is an incredibly diverse identity. It includes people like me who were born disabled, those who maybe grow older and age into disability, or potentially someone who has survived COVID and is now living with lifelong chronic fatigue. So just like everyone else, technology plays a instrumental role in the day-to-day lives of people with disabilities. And to be clear, that's if we can afford it and if we can get access to it in the first place. So I really want to emphasize the importance of creating, developing affordable, accessible technology. And if the tech itself isn't affordable outright, creating programs that make it affordable. You know, the FCC already has numerous regulations requiring accessible communications and connectivity, and we want to see further enforcement and enhancement of those regulations. I believe we just celebrated the 10-year anniversary of the 21st Century Communications Act, which is the law that really created a sort of new standard for accessible communications across broadband and was a real win for the disability community. I think one of the things that is a big concern is that there's an enormous digital divide amongst people with disabilities, and a lot of it has to do with the significant poverty that people with disabilities and specifically disabled people of color experience. We want to see broadband expanded to every community with the least barriers to that adoption. So there are a number of programs that folks can sign up for to get either lower rate access or free access, but they're not very well known. And I want to see both federal agencies and organizations like yours and others that focus on broadband adoption to do meaningful engagement with the disability community to figure out, how do we communicate in a way that really hits at what you need and not make any assumptions. When you're thinking about the disability community, we should think about family members and caregivers, but if you want real engagement on these issues and you want to understand how access to broadband is affecting the disability community, make sure that people with disabilities are at the table speaking for ourselves.
As you said, our mission is to advance the civil rights of Asian Americans and to promote a fair and equitable society for all. So what does that mean? That means for us, based in DC, we focus a lot on federal policy with federal lawmakers, as well as some state lawmakers on issues that matter to the community. We litigate. We are part of impact litigation throughout the country, whether it's on issues such as census or voting rights or immigration, to make sure that the Asian voice counts in all of these different circles. Then we are part of narrative change, really making sure that the media understands these stories about the Asian American community. There were other organizations that asked us, well, why are you getting involved in tech and telecom? That seems a little bit askew from quote unquote traditional civil rights issues. And my answer was very easy, which is just as housing is a civil rights issue, just as banking is a civil rights issue, just as employment is a civil rights issue, technology and telecom is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. That embeds in so much of what we do now, whether it is education, whether it is employment, whether it is financial services. So that's sort of the lens in which we decide that we had to be involved in this space. And it is part of our work today. So you talk about some of the big issues that we work on. On one side of the ledger are, if you will, core civil rights issues around facial recognition and what that does to law enforcement, around algorithmic bias and what that does to what our consumers, the Asian American consumers, see or are able to purchase. But then it gets into other core issues of technology and telecom, which goes to broadband access, broadband affordability, and digital literacy. So one of the common myths about Asian Americans is that we are already highly technologically savvy, we are first adopters of technology, and that some of these issues don't matter as much to Asian Americans. And on one level, there's a certain segment of Asian Americans for which that is true. But there's a whole swath of Asian Americans, particularly Vietnamese, Southeast Asian, Filipino, that do not fall into that category. You think about Pacific Islanders and their access to broadband. And in certain parts of the Hawaiian Islands, it is very low. So making sure that we give voice to that entire diversity of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and when we talk about these issues, has been critical to us. The other place that certainly we share very much common ground with respect to HTTP is around language access. For Asian Americans, about 1/3 of our community are limited English proficient. So if you think about anything related to technology, how it appears on the web, how it appears on your smartphone, and you start thinking to yourself, what does that mean for someone that does not speak English as their first language, or typically would not navigate things in English? What sort of access do they have as we get into this modern society? And so that's another area that we spend a fair bit of time, is to make sure we hone in on those issues and develop some smart solutions there. There shouldn't be that same sort of partisan divide. And we should think about how to deliver real solutions to all of America. Because if, as you were saying, if you're talking about broadband access for rural America, right, that is something that hits on a lot of different segments of the community. It should be appealing to Republicans. It should be appealing to Democrats. For my community, certainly it appeals to Pacific Islanders. It appeals to farmers working in rural parts of the United States.
I am the son of immigrants, born and raised here in the U.S., and actually grew up in New York. But my father is Jamaican, from Jamaica, West Indies, and my mother is from Mexico, right? And so that's not a usual, typical kind of combination, much less for folks growing up in New York, of all places. But that is really, I think, in some ways central to my whole journey, because from a very early age, from as far back as I can remember, in almost every room I was in, except perhaps with the exception perhaps of a room with my two older sisters as a kid, I was always a little different, right, than everybody else around me. I decided that in my mind, one of the most effective ways to address all of these large systemic issues was to ensure that we had more leaders from our communities who were in positions of influence, who were in place to make decisions, to direct allocations of resources and efforts, et cetera, who would then represent our interests and also, again, try to ensure a fairer playing field and more opportunities for everyone. And so I started working in various different roles and ways to essentially sort of do leadership development to try and help develop both that personal pride and that higher ambition for folks from our communities, but also then to equip them with the tools and the supports and the networks that they needed in order to actually get into and access those leadership roles. Because we realized it was absolutely critical, right? We sort of knew even 3 years ago that it was something that was increasingly a part of everyone's life, was increasingly the ways in which people accessed information, the ways in which people manage some of their lives, and that technology in some ways could provide solutions, as technology often does, and simplify and ease and even increase the benefits that people have in life. But at other times, in some ways, it helps to hold gaps and disparities in place. It serves to maintain barriers and to keep inequities, right? And of course, this year in particular, it's even more crucial than ever because we've seen that it's infinitely more essential to our lives as a result of the pandemic, right? And now it's not just about information. It's not just about media consumption, which is another piece that technology is often raised about, but it's also now things as fundamental as education, right? For as far down as kindergarten, right? And it's also health, right? The ways in which people are accessing the explosion of telehealth is a perfect example of the ways in which technology is now even more a part of our lives. Technology is one of the places where there actually could be, and so we want to foster conversations to see if there are best practices already emerging, right? If there are reforms and ideas, if there are new activities that are being that are happening in the technology industry that policymakers could learn from to actually think about crafting policy that ensures that bias isn't inadvertently there, for example, or that security and privacy is maintained, or most fundamentally, right, that access is available, right, so that people can both get onto technology, find affordable ways, or that someone's economic status doesn't actually preclude them from being a part of the digital economy simply by virtue of their economic status.
Hola, mami.
Juan, últimamente mi teléfono funciona donde lo necesito.
Es que te cambié a T-Mobile, que tiene la red 5G más grande del país. Ahora tiene mejor cobertura 5G que nunca.
Ah, me estás diciendo que es importante estar bien cubierto.
Pues claro.
Entonces, ponte un suéter y cúbrete, que te va a dar gripe.
Ay, mamá. Ahora, T-Mobile tiene más torres, más ingenieros y más cobertura que nunca.
Ay, mamá.
Hello HCTP, Alberto Vargas here. Just wanted to drop in and say hello. I will be watching from Los Angeles, California, así que I'm super excited for this summit. Alejandro, congratulations on all your hard work. I'm looking forward to it, así que saludos. Stay safe, everybody.
Today, having broadband access is linked to our health, our well-being, and our economic security. This is especially true for the Latino community, Black and Indigenous communities of color, as well as rural and low-income households or families who are experiencing economic hardship because of the coronavirus and who might face compounding obstacles to establishing and sustaining a reliable at-home broadband connection. Having access to the internet allows students to continue to learn. It gives parents the options to pursue remote employment options, and it allows us to host this virtual summit from the comfort of my home. Central to the solution of bridging the digital divide is our ability to extend broadband infrastructure to every home at an affordable price. At the heart of our government strategy to ensure that every American is connected is the Federal Communications Commission, an independent government agency with congressional oversight who is responsible for enforcing America's communication laws and regulations. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Ajit Pai, current chairman of the FCC, to what I am lovingly calling our kitchen table conversations on race, technology, and the future of everything as a part of our inaugural Digital Inclusion Summit. Ajit is the son of immigrants from India who grew up in the state of Kansas and was first appointed to the FCC by President Obama, where he was confirmed unanimously by the US Senate. He was later designated as chairman by President Trump in 2017, where he currently leads the FCC's efforts to regulate the country's communications infrastructure, including TV, phone, and internet service. Ajit, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hello, everybody. My gratitude to Alejandro and everybody at the Hispanic Telecom and Technology Partnership for inviting me to be a part of the hopefully first of many, Digital Inclusion Summit. I look forward to today's question and answer session, but before I get to that, I've been asked to deliver some brief remarks. And so I'd like to start off, if I might, with a story. In November of 2017, I visited Puerto Rico to survey the damage from hurricanes Irma and Maria. Almost 2 months had passed since those historic storms, the devastation was still unlike anything I had ever seen. There were remnants from mudslides, there were downed power lines, there was debris everywhere on and off the roads. And I specifically remember seeing a huge concrete pole that was used for stringing power lines that had been bent over by about 120 degrees. Some 47% of the cell sites on the island were still out of service, which, believe it or not, was actually tremendous progress from just a few weeks before, when 95% of the cell sites were out immediately after the storm. Now, the FCC acted quickly to help with the initial restoration efforts. Under my direction, we provided an immediate infusion of about $66 million from our Universal Service Fund to help carriers in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The FCC later set up what we call the Uniendo a Puerto Rico Fund and the Connect USVI Fund, which in their first stages alone provided an extra $130 million in funding for network restoration in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Now, while I'm gratified that the FCC moved very quickly to provide immediate relief, I'm also especially proud that we didn't stop there. In fact, in March of 2018, I made a return visit to Puerto Rico, and it was clear that the island faced many connectivity challenges that preceded these historic storms. And so appropriately and accordingly, the FCC approved up to $950 million, almost $1 billion, in additional investments through a second stage of funding for both the Uniendo a Puerto Rico Fund and the Connect USVI Fund. Now, the goal of this funding goes far beyond simply recovering from the devastating storms of Irma and Maria. It's more about connecting everyone in Puerto Rico with what I call digital opportunity and ensuring that the hardened networks will be there to withstand the next storm, which we know will come someday. It's about bringing broadband connectivity to people and places in Puerto Rico and indeed other territories that have never had broadband access. So this is not a plan to return Puerto Rico to the way things were, but a bold plan to move Puerto Rico fully forward into a digital future. Now, I tell you this story at some length, for which I apologize, but because I think it applies directly to our current crisis. If there is one positive to come out of the pandemic, it's that it has ended once and for all any debate about the need for universal access to high-speed broadband. If you don't have broadband, you can't work from home. Your children can't attend online classes. You can't see a healthcare provider immediately and remotely. You can't FaceTime with your parents or other loved ones who are staying safe at home. I could go on, but I think Alejandro framed it very well, the importance of digital connectivity in the unfortunate times in which we are living. At the onset of the pandemic, the FCC decided that our top priority was to make sure that as many Americans as possible would have internet access and that no American consumer would lose service because of disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's why, to meet this priority, among other things, in mid-March, I called upon America's broadband and telephone providers to sign on to what I call the Keep Americans Connected pledge. This pledge had three basic parts. Number one, that no consumer would have broadband or telephone service cut off as a result of disruptions caused by the pandemic. Number two, that any late fees or similar charges would be waived because of those similar disruptions. And number three, that Wi-Fi hotspots would be opened up for any consumer who might need them. Ultimately, almost 800 companies representing the vast majority of American consumers signed the pledge, and that pledge was extended until June. Many companies even went above and beyond the pledge to offer things like free service for some constituencies, to work with schools and hospitals and others, and to provide additional things that went beyond the pledge. Now, again, COVID-19 has raised the awareness among the American people about the importance of closing the digital divide. And I will say the Keep Americans Connected pledge proved to be a very effective solution to the immediate connectivity challenges highlighted by the pandemic. But across the country, just as in Puerto Rico, as I discussed, we had a connectivity gap before the pandemic that will still be a challenge in the years ahead. COVID-19, for instance, is not the reason why 23% of Hispanic households with school-age children lack access to home broadband. That is the digital divide with which too many Americans have been living. That is the priority that we have made our top priority over the last several years. And that's why the FCC has pursued and will continue to pursue an aggressive strategy to connect all Americans, including Hispanic households. Now, in the United States, of course, we primarily rely on roughly about $80 billion in private investment every year to upgrade and expand our wired and wireless networks. And that's why bridging the digital divide requires reducing the cost of broadband build-out, which in turn requires reducing the regulatory barriers to such build-out. Now, across the board, the FCC has been working hard to modernize its regulations and to clear out any unnecessary roadblocks to broadband investment. The details of this can sound definitely boring, I will concede. Easing access to utility poles, making it easier for companies to transition from copper to fiber, moving from rules developed in the 1930s to regulate Ma Bell to a more forward-thinking market-based framework and other policies like that. But however arcane the details, the results really pop. They're certainly anything but arcane. Millions more Americans have access to the internet today than they did in 2016. In 2018, we set a record for fiber deployment in the United States, a record that was broken in 2019. The number of small cells in the United States and cell sites generally has skyrocketed. Average download speeds for fixed broadband have doubled since the end of 2017. The number of Americans enjoying more than two options for standard fixed terrestrial broadband service has increased by 52%. And a new independent study came out just this month showing that compared to 2015, today's average consumer is paying 28% less for broadband in real terms while enjoying faster speeds. So we've made a lot of progress, but that's not a reason to say, job done, let's move on, because we still have work to do. Here's the bottom line. On my first day as FCC chairman, I said that my number one priority, our agency's number one priority, would be closing the digital divide and making sure that every consumer would have the benefits of the digital revolution, regardless of what he or she happened to look like or where they happen to live. We've made a lot of progress towards that goal over the last 3.5 years, but we're not going to be letting up anytime soon. And so I look forward to working with the Hispanic Telecom and Technology Partnership and other dedicated advocates like you to make sure that we deliver digital opportunity to every single American. Thanks so much again for having me, and I look forward to a very successful Digital Inclusion Summit. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ajit. I think that you really bring up a lot of really interesting points, and I think that we really were tested. COVID-19 really tested the capacity of our networks. It tested, I think, the spirit of collaboration between internet service providers and local government. And I think, like as you highlighted, since your first day as chairman of FCC, you really have been clear that your top priority is closing the digital divide. So from your perspective, and having traveled extensively through rural towns across America to understand, I think, their unique kind of service needs, what do you think it's going to take to achieve universal broadband access in both rural communities and underserved urban areas?
That's the key question. I think there are basically two tools in the toolbox that we need to wield, and in some cases we might need additional authority to wield. Number one is continuing to reduce the regulatory burden to create a better business case for broadband deployment. Obviously, as I mentioned, we rely heavily on the private sector to build these networks, and it's an iron law of economics that if the return on the investment isn't there, there's not going to be a business case for building these networks. So we want to make sure that we streamline the process to, of course, protect the public interest and consumer protection in particular, but also create a business case for deployment. And that's where the things like pole attachment reform and encouraging the migration from copper to fiber is so important. But secondly, and critically, I think that federal funding, and funding at all levels of government, honestly, is very necessary. In my first major speech as FCC chairman in March of 2017, I said that as Congress was considering an infrastructure plan, that I thought that substantial funding for broadband was important. And I continue to believe that today. We are going to be starting in a few weeks a $20 billion Rural Digital Opportunity Fund to get unserved parts of the country connected. We're also going to be starting a 5G fund, which will be $9 billion to connect parts of the country which are unlikely to see 5G wireless connectivity. Even with that, we anticipate there are going to be some parts of the country that will still remain unserved. And so that's why we've been working with Congress and encouraging them to think broadly about how we are going to get everybody connected. Every American needs this platform to be able to do things like telework and telehealth. So we need to work with Congress to make sure in a bipartisan way that we're able to do that.
And as you've kind of illustrated in your remarks so far, your regulatory philosophy really has been guided by a few simple principles with the goal of establishing a regulatory framework that will result in more investment, faster economic growth, and lower prices. So I wonder, having this being kind of like our Digital Inclusion Summit, could you share with us, what's the role that equity and inclusion play in shaping your policies and your regulatory philosophy?
It's absolutely vital. And that's why I don't say broadband access so much as I say digital opportunity, because to me, that's really what this is about. It's informed, as you hinted at in your first question, by some of my travels. I mean, these are the stories that stick with me when I'm in my office or now, of course, during the pandemic, working here at home. It's the story about visiting the Jemez Pueblo and seeing how low-income tribal members for the first time have access to fiber at the local tribal school and kids can do their homework. It's the visit to the San Fernando Institute for Applied Media, where I met 3 different groups of parents, each of whom had Spanish as a primary language, who told me, which I can understand in my own broken Spanish, how important it was for them to have, for their kids to have internet access and for them to have internet access for things like applying for jobs. It's the very last visit I did to Wyoming, rural Wyoming, before the pandemic ended the FCC's travel, to the Wind River Reservation, where I met with the Northern Arapaho tribal leaders who told me how getting Connect America funding from the FCC in 2018 had now allowed the tribal school and the tribal health clinic to get connected with fiber, which was a game changer. I mean, these are the people who you rarely will see on the front pages of the newspaper or on the cable news networks, but they are the Americans who need to be the foot soldiers of the digital revolution. We need to be able to connect them. That's all about inclusion. And I also would like to say that, this is important to me personally in terms of my management at the agency. If you look at some of the things we've done on diversity, reconstituting the Advisory Committee on Diversity and Digital Empowerment, which before I took office had just fallen into disrepair, starting an internship program to make sure that the next generation of talent, especially from HBCUs and other minority-serving institutions, can have a stipend so that they can actually work at the FCC and to make sure that our own workforce reflects the richness of the American social fabric. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are important to let the American people know that we're leading not just in word through the orders and reforms we push out, but also in deed, how it is that we represent the face of the FCC to the American people.
That's really wonderful. I'd heard that you guys have started kind of like an internship program, but it's great to hear that it's paid and that it has the intentionality of including historically kind of like underserved communities. So that's awesome.
And I have to give credit for that to Commissioner Starks as well. Commissioner Starks came up with the idea. We're working together on it. Just another good example of how diversity and inclusion is not a Democratic issue or Republican issue. It's just an American issue to me.
Absolutely. And so our goal here with the Digital Inclusion Summit really is to convene diverse stakeholders to establish real solutions through an intersectional lens that considers how factors such as race, zip code, cultural background, and ability impact broadband adoption rates and either limits or expands the circle of digital opportunity. As a representative voice yourself and an influential voice, how are you working with Congress and industry leaders during this time of great change to center the lives and experiences of communities of color to ensure that we're creating the future of everything that is inclusive, equitable, and safe? And from your perspective, what does that future look like?
That's a really good question. So to me, at least, some of it involves our basic programmatic work that I just described, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, the 5G Fund. All of these types of programs and regulatory reforms have an eye, as I said, to making sure that every American has access who wants it. But even more than that, I think it's important for us to be able to push some reforms through Congress. So for example, in 2016, I proposed what I call digital Gigabit Opportunity Zones. And the idea here is that you would pick a geographic area. It could be a very rural county, or it could be an urban city block, which had 75% or less of the national median income. And Congress would provide essentially tax breaks to allow companies to build infrastructure in those areas, to make it easier for those areas to get broadband access. There's bipartisan legislation that was introduced in the Senate, for example, by Senator Capito from West Virginia and Senator Coons from Delaware, a Republican and a Democrat, following up on this. It's called the Gigabit Opportunity Act. And so that's the kind of thing I've been trying to push for a while, to make sure that whether you're in an urban area or in a rural area, where the Congress is stepping up to the plate to make that business case easier. So, working with advocates and with elected officials, I hope that we can finally push this big boulder, so to speak, up to the top of the mountain.
Absolutely. And I think what this kind of global health crisis has kind of taught us is that, bridging the digital divide and achieving universal access really will take a collaborative and integrated approach with both, agencies like the FCC, with Congress, with local communities. And so I think that is paramount and important to really kind of establishing kind of like a durable solution that connects every American. So I feel like for the past 3 years, your policies have also not been without a little bit of criticism, right? So specifically on So specifically on the issue of net neutrality, right?
Yeah.
What do you think that people misunderstand about your regulatory approach on this issue and its impact on not just its ability to incentivize deployment, but also how we as consumers experience the internet, specifically for diverse communities who may already face compounding barriers to access and adoption?
That's a fantastic question. It's very interesting. I go on Twitter pretty much daily now at this point and do a search for some of these tweets. And it's amazing how many people say, wow, remember how we thought the internet was going to end in 2017? Whatever happened with that? And it was such a big sound and fury, and nothing ever came of it. And that's exactly the point. A lot of these predictions that were made back in December of 2017, you're going to have to pay $5 per tweet. You'll get the internet one word at a time, or this is the end of the internet as we know it, as one news outlet put it. All of those have just fallen by the wayside. In fact, as I mentioned during my remarks, average fixed broadband speeds in the U.S. have doubled since we made that decision. Millions more Americans have access to the internet. We've set records in terms of fiber deployment and wireless infrastructure investment. So the internet overall is very strong, and it's getting better. And what's very interesting is the comparison with Europe. Europe still has the utility-style net neutrality regulation that many of those advocates here in the U.S. seem to support. And where is Europe's internet right now? Well, I actually just read this afternoon an article on Bloomberg, and I'm actually reading the headline, October 9th, Pandemic Exposes Europe's Creaking Internet for All to See. And they talk about the fact that they've had subpar infrastructure investment for years, and that's part of the reason why now the European Commission, the group that supervises all member states of the European Union, had to go proactively to YouTube and Netflix and other streaming companies during the pandemic and ask them to proactively throttle content to consumers from HD down to SD. So now consumers have the worst of all worlds. They have these utility-style regulations, and they have poor internet service as a result. So notwithstanding all of the heat that we've taken, that I personally have taken over the last 3 years, I know we made the right decision, the courageous decision, the decision to restore the bipartisan market-based framework that had governed the internet so well from 1996 until 2015. And the proof is now in the pudding. With the pandemic, even with the influx of internet traffic we've seen over the last 7 months, the networks have held up very well, and speeds are actually up over the last 7 months of the pandemic, which is not something you'd expect to see if you had these utility-style regulations.
This year, you're going to hear a lot about what 5G will do, how it could help firefighters see through smoke, connect ambulances with hospitals in real time, give rescuers new tools to locate survivors. But this isn't a commercial about what 5G will do. It's about what 5G will never do. 5G won't replace the courage it takes to run into the fire. It won't make the decision to become an officer any less selfless, or have any impact on what's required to put others' lives before your own. It can't take the place of bravery or substitute for compassion. It will never be the reason people make the choice to serve. 5G is going to change a lot of things, but luckily for all of us, not everything.
Share the light, won't hold us down. Share the light, won't hold us down.
Hey HTTP, congrats on the summit. Me and the kids will be watching from home. Hey, but we really want to do a shout out. Thank you so much for being a great organization that is looking to empower the Latinx community in tech and telecom. We're rooting for you.
COVID-19 has forced an overnight shift to an almost entirely digital way of conducting the business of everyday life, including sensitive aspects of our lives like healthcare, and with it, a call to use technology tools to track the spread of the disease through digital contact tracing. This quick development and deployment of digital tools is raising more and more questions about the security of our personal data, which has opened a unique window for bipartisan consensus on the need to establish a federal framework to protect consumer privacy nationwide. The lack of consumer privacy protections in the United States has created a pathway to unintended harms for Black and Brown communities. For HTTP, the establishment of a consistent policy framework to protect our sensitive data is also a call to ensure that consumer privacy is grounded in civil rights principles as a way of mitigating discriminatory harms that have led to deceptive voter suppression, misinformation online, housing discrimination and digital redlining, employment discrimination, predatory lending, and the facilitation of warrantless government surveillance and policing practices. For privacy legislation to fully protect against the wide array of civil rights harms from commercial data practices, we must center the voices of communities most directly affected by those practices and work with Congress to empower the Federal Trade Commission with rulemaking authority and the funding necessary to help them regulate unfair and discriminatory data practices. I had the opportunity to sit down with FTC Commissioner Christine Wilson earlier this summer to discuss her thoughts on consumer privacy and the current and future role of the FTC in mitigating consumer harm.
Thank you so much to HTTP for having me today. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate your interest in this topic. Privacy has been a significant focus of mine since the pandemic began, with the increasing focus on the use of health data and location data, not just in the United States, but around the world, as a way of potentially containing the spread of the virus, which of course is a good thing, but there are perhaps unintended consequences. And so it is a very important issue to me, and I am pleased to hear of your interest in the topic and to be here with you today to talk about it. Of course, before I begin, I need to give you the standard disclaimer that, of course, nothing I say today is necessarily reflective of the view of the Federal Trade Commission or any other commissioner. I am speaking on behalf of myself and myself only today. So let me begin with a brief introduction. The Federal Trade Commission, as you probably know, has a broad consumer protection mission to combat unfair and deceptive practices, and privacy falls within this broad mission. So we use our general authority under Section 5 of the FTC Act to reach privacy, but we also enforce privacy and data security statutes for certain sectors, including the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which covers credit, COPPA, which covers children's privacy, Gramm-Leach-Bliley and the Safeguards Rule, which cover financial information, and then the Health Breach Notification Rule, which covers some health providers. And for many years, the agency on a bipartisan basis has called for comprehensive federal privacy legislation to boost the jurisdiction and the authority of the FTC in the privacy and data security arena. Tech developments related to COVID-19, including contact tracing and monitoring to ensure compliance with stay-at-home orders, rely on sensitive health and location information. And so these developments have further underscored the need for federal privacy legislation because they've highlighted some gaps in U.S. privacy laws. Federal privacy legislation is necessary, as you said, to protect key consumer protection values that are within the FTC's jurisdiction, but there are also civil liberties that are at issue. You highlighted some of them. Today, I'm going to focus most specifically on Fourth Amendment rights. There are claims and public reporting that contact tracing apps have been used by law enforcement to track people for non-public health purposes, and we'll get into that in a bit. So today, I want to address just a handful of topics. First, how the pandemic has underscored the privacy concerns. Second, the constitutional issues that are implicated. Third, the need for federal privacy legislation, and then in conclusion, how to mitigate some of the risks to privacy and civil liberty that we're seeing. So let me start first with the privacy, technology, and COVID-19 topic. Many governments are turning to technology to help monitor and enforce quarantines and for contact tracing to contain the disease. We've seen this at the federal, state, and local levels in the United States, but we've also seen it in a variety of countries around the world. And many are viewing technology, including comprehensive contact tracing, as key to safely easing quarantines and resuming normal life. But notably, these efforts are fueled by sensitive data regarding people's movements and their health. So one example is the Apple-Google partnership. They recently announced a contact tracing platform that has garnered global attention. Authorities have been invited to create apps for this platform, which relies on Bluetooth technology to detect proximity to other devices. And users receive alerts if they come into contact with infected individuals. Apple and Google have promised that users who share a diagnosis via the app will not have their identities disclosed to the companies or other users. The data will only be used by public health officials. Microsoft and the University of Washington have announced a contact tracing app called COVID Safe. Using GPS location data from an infected person's phone, public health authorities can post alerts disclosing the locations visited by the person who has coronavirus. And individuals can use the app to cross-reference the location data in their own phones to determine if they were in the same location at the same time. These initiatives are new, so little is known about the kinds of information that will be collected, who will have access to it, with whom it will be shared, how long it will be retained, and a host of other questions that we would typically be interested in understanding as privacy experts. There are also really important questions about the efficacy of these apps. There are recent studies that assert contact tracing via app lacks the superior accuracy of manual tracing. Not only that, there are cautions that these apps may be subject to manipulation for nefarious purposes. And so in the end, it could be the worst of both worlds, right? You're using these technology-driven solutions that are, first of all, inferior in effectiveness to the manual contact tracing, but second of all, open to being hacked or being exploited for nefarious purposes. In mid-June, the National Association of Attorneys General wrote a letter to Apple and to Google expressing concerns about unofficial contact tracing apps in the App Store and the Google Play Store, which they asserted may endanger consumers' personal information. So obviously, technology holds promise, but it also raises a great deal of concerns. Let me touch briefly on the constitutional issues. The Fourth Amendment protects Americans from government overreach. And in the case law, there is what we call a reasonable expectation of privacy test. And so if a citizen has a reasonable expectation of privacy in something and the government tries to seize it without a warrant, his reasonable expectation of privacy is violated, and therefore the Fourth Amendment has been breached. But companies' mass data collection affects our rights under the Fourth Amendment. Consumers, of course, have grown accustomed to surrendering extensive data through their daily use of phones, computers, digital assistants, and other connected devices. And this phenomenon has inevitable spillover effects in the legal arena. In other words, if citizens know and accept that nothing is private, then they have no reasonable expectation of privacy, and protections under the Fourth Amendment get eviscerated. So police have long been able to enforce the law based on direct observation of violations. But if authorities identify law violations, for example, contravening stay-at-home orders based on data collection rather than direct observation, the Fourth Amendment may be implicated. In two recent cases, the Supreme Court of the United States limited the warrantless tracking of Americans through cell phone data and GPS devices placed on their cars. While GPS data could help contain the spread of COVID-19, it could also be used to establish violations of stay-at-home orders. It could also be used to identify people who have attended protests across the country in recent weeks, and there were rumors that in fact that data has been used in that way. And so we at a federal, state, and local level have government entities who are grappling with these issues and potentially implicating not just the privacy of Americans, but also their civil liberties. Let me talk for a minute about current limitations in federal privacy laws. So we do have, as I said, broad privacy authority under Section 5 of the FTC Act, and we also focus on enforcement of specific sectoral privacy laws. One of those is HIPAA. So HIPAA and other laws govern privacy rules for information that's collected by healthcare professionals and traditional public health contact tracers. But consumers are providing health data to many more entities, including Fitbit, Apple Watch, and the makers of smart thermometers. Of course, there's also low-tech data collection. As restaurants and other businesses are reopening, they're taking customers' temperatures and they're keeping track of who has visited at what times. There's a gentleman named Travis LeBlanc, who is a Democrat on the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, who recently wrote a letter to Acting Secretary Chad Wolf of DHS. And he wrote to express concerns about plans to check airline passengers' temperatures before they boarded the flight. He said the pandemic is not a hall pass to disregard the privacy and civil liberties of the traveling public. And I would expand on what Travis said. The pandemic is not a hall pass to disregard the privacy and civil liberties of the public in any way, shape, or form, regardless of whether they are traveling or pursuing other activities. So the FTC has long used this broad consumer protection authority that I referenced to safeguard Americans' privacy and data security, but its specific privacy authority is limited, and there is no general privacy law that covers every company that collects data on folks in the United States. So I have called on Congress to pass federal privacy legislation that would provide more transparency to consumers and greater certainty to businesses about the types of data that can be collected and how those data can be used and shared. With established legal boundaries, companies would be better equipped to determine when the government is asking them to cross the line for the public good, if they are being asked to share information with the government or with researchers who in turn would share reports with the government, and also whether those companies should require a subpoena or inform customers before turning over data. Since the pandemic began, there have been a number of bills introduced, one by Republicans, one by Democrats, and one on a bipartisan basis that would require companies to get affirmative express consent before collecting COVID-19 data. These bills do agree on some issues, including the need to obtain affirmative express consent rather than infer consent from inaction, the obligation to provide an effective way to revoke consent, and enforcement by the FTC under its authority against unfair or deceptive practices and by state attorneys general. But the proposals diverge on some of the same points that unfortunately previously held up passage of a baseline privacy law, whether the federal law preempts state law, for example, and whether consumers should have a private right of action to obtain damages, and whether this right can be subject to binding arbitration. Regardless of which bill is adopted, voluntary measures will fail if a critical mass of Americans don't participate. In other words, if there is no digital trust, which should incentivize both the public and private sectors to demonstrate their trustworthiness. And a narrow privacy bill dealing only with the conditions of the pandemic, personally, I think, is far less preferable than comparable, comprehensive legislation that will provide broad guidance for years to come.
Facebook is a place where more than 1 billion people worldwide come to share their thoughts and feelings. Our systems catch many things like porn and spam before most people even see them. But we also encourage our community to confidentially report things they think violate our standards. People send us millions of reports like this each week. Automation helps us prioritize the ones that go to our team of human reviewers who work 24/7 in over 40 languages across the globe. Their job is to carefully review reports against our community standards. After examining the issue with language and cultural context in mind, they make a decision, usually within 24 hours, though matters of urgent safety come first. Through this process, violating posts are removed on an ongoing basis. And we're constantly improving to give you more control over what you see, helping us to make Facebook a more safe and welcoming place for everyone. Find out more at facebook.com/communitystandards.
Hello, HTTP, Dorissa Griffin here, and I am beyond excited for your inaugural Digital Inclusion Summit. Alejandro, I know you and your team have worked tirelessly to bring together an outstanding and engaging virtual event that will help to move the dial forward on inclusion for diverse communities. So on behalf of your partners at MMTC, congratulations and keep up the amazing advocacy.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Alejandro, for inviting me to say a few words today, virtually, of course, at your Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnerships Digital Inclusion Summit. That's a lot of words. Your work as Executive Director of the HTTP, okay, a lot easier, bringing together an amazing coalition of 17 of the country's leading Hispanic nonprofit organizations to promote digital equity is so critical right now. We sure know it in the middle of this pandemic. And your efforts help support more than 50 million Hispanic Latino Americans access education, economic, and healthcare opportunities with the technology tools and the resources they need. HTTP's leadership has never been more important as we face this public health and economic crisis, especially because we know that this virus is disproportionately impacting the Latino community. And as many schools have transitioned to online learning, we've got first graders learning the mute button, and businesses have sadly closed. Students and families are relying on the internet to learn and work from home, search for jobs, and access telehealth services. Yet a study found that only 61% of Latino households have broadband at home. Sometimes it's not having the equipment, but a lot of times it's not having high-speed access. That is simply unacceptable. That's why this summer I introduced the Accessible, Affordable Internet for All Act, which will greatly expand access to affordable high-speed internet for everyone. My bill, which is led by Jim Clyburn over in the House, includes a $100 billion investment for high-speed broadband infrastructure nationwide and would ensure that internet service is affordable by providing a $50 monthly discount on internet plans for low-income consumers. It also includes $685 million to establish grant programs for states to close gaps in broadband adoption and help ensure people in every community have the tools, support, and technology they need to take advantage of internet access by investing in digital inclusion projects. In 2020, we should be able to connect every single family to high-speed internet, regardless of their zip code. It shouldn't be one family gets to learn with the internet and the other has to do it over the phone or by paper and pencil. And while our use of the internet expands as we work to ensure every family is connected, we must also make sure we take steps to protect our personal data. And I did want to add something on this. In December, I introduced the Consumer Online Privacy Rights Act along with Senators Cantwell, Schatz, and Markey to establish digital rules of the road to put consumers in control of their private information and hold big tech companies accountable. I also lead a bipartisan bill with Senator Kennedy, who's a Republican from Louisiana, and that would give consumers the right to access and control how their personal data is being used and require companies to establish and maintain a privacy security program. Our bill also includes provisions to prohibit personal data from being used to discriminate in housing, education, and employment decisions, including decisions based on algorithms. It's time for Congress to do its job and pass comprehensive privacy legislation, and I know that with your help, working together, we can get it done and accomplish some remarkable things. Thank you for your hard work and continuing to make your voices heard. Yours is a growing, strong community, especially in our business world. I'm pretty excited for what's to come next year. Let's get this done. We need you now more than ever. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ramiro Cavazos. I'm the president and CEO of the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. We were founded in 1979 in Santa Fe, New Mexico by 5 small business owners, men and women, who wanted to fight and make sure that Latino businesses were at the decision-making tables, corporate America, government, and of course, day-to-day business and commerce. We're very proud that we represent a board of directors. Our chairwoman is Alice Rodriguez, and we are led by our chambers. We have 260 Hispanic chambers in our nationwide network from Seattle to Puerto Rico, Rhode Island to Honolulu, Wisconsin, Minnesota, all the way to the Magic Valley of South Texas. Our staff works very, very hard on behalf of those chambers, but our 4.7 million Hispanic-owned businesses. We have 61 million Latinos in America. 1 out of every 6 of us is self-identified as Latino, and we cross all currents, and our strength is our diversity and the love that we have for this nation and our culture and for one another. We're Caucasian, we're Asian, we're Afro-Latinos, we're rich, poor, we're Jewish, Muslim, Protestant, and Christian, all walks of life, all industries. And we work very hard to make sure that we have the infrastructure that we need. And now with technology being the new economy, we're very proud to stand with HTTP, the Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership, all of its members and affiliates, each of you that's tuning in, and these great panel members that are going to be speaking to you today that are experts in their field. It's very important that we continue to build on our programs that we provide nationwide through our chambers to build capacity with small business owners through our Avanzar program, We also have initiatives where we provide chamber grants to our chambers to give them the resources that they need. And we work very hard at procurement, building contracting opportunities with Fortune 1000 firms, getting more Latinos and Latinas on corporate boards, and ensuring that our tax dollars, that the U.S. government, the largest buying service in the world, also buys goods and services from our Latino-owned businesses. So we're very proud of our procurement programs, our capacity building programs, and programs to enrich our chambers. We will continue to do our work, working with Alejandro Rourke, with the HTTP as the executive director. Thank you, Alejandro, for the powerful work you do and the board of directors that you represent. This is a great panel today. We'll continue to do our part at the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, representing the future economy, and the best days are ahead for us because we are the engine of America's economic future. So we encourage you to learn as much as you can about the need for more infrastructure and broadband and technology. And we're very proud to be members of HTTP, and the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce will continue to be your ally and your partner. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you, Alejandro, for the work that you do.
Thank you, Ramiro. Achieving the goal of full digital inclusion and universal broadband adoption, both today in the wake of COVID-19 and into the future, will take a collaborative and integrated approach with policymakers, private industry, and in partnership with local communities. Across the United States, internet service providers have spent billions of dollars building out our telecommunications infrastructure and billions more each year to maintain those networks. And they play an important role in us understanding where current coverage gaps currently are and in sparking collective action at all levels to reimagine how we meet our country's connectivity needs today. To understand how telecommunications service providers are thinking through these dynamic problems, I sat down with Jonathan Spalter, CEO of US Telecom, the Broadband Association, Shirley Bloomfield, CEO of the Rural Broadband Association, Michael Powell, CEO of NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, and Meredith Baker, CEO of CTIA, the Wireless Association. Here are the highlights from those conversations as we discussed what actions Congress, regulators, and broadband providers and digital inclusion advocates like us can take to deliver real solutions for historically disconnected communities across the country.
Our mission is very clear. We're all about trying to create opportunities and incentives for our nation's broadband providers to work in partnership with government and the broader technology ecosystem to deliver the promise that broadband technology we know, specifically in this time of challenge, this national health emergency that we're navigating, can bring to us all. Broadband is the connective tissue that binds our country's opportunities, our economy, and our social life together in ways that we could not even have imagined even just 5 years ago. The billions of dollars of investment that our broadband providers are making in our nation's infrastructure have gone a long way to including more of our fellow citizens, our neighbors, our families, our enterprises in the opportunities of our economy. We have a long way to go to ensure that we can connect everybody to the potential that connectivity can bring, to make sure that that connectivity is accessible and that its tools are also able to be used by every part of our society. On a personal level, I got to say this too. I don't think any one of us is not touched by how broadband-enabled technology can bring hope, opportunity, inclusion, and access to even life-saving tools. Many of us have parents and grandparents that now can use these devices that we're using for improving their well-being, improving their health, public safety, our kids learning through these networks that we're so proud to build and to deploy. This all came very close to home for me about 9 years ago when one of my children was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. She was lucky to get into a clinical trial at Stanford University's Children's Hospital. And her care team wasn't just nurses and doctors. They were network engineers and coders writing algorithms. Broadband has become an essential feature for my daughter's ability to lead a healthy, connected life where she can interact with the cloud, with her endocrinologists that can autonomously regulate her insulin levels. And as a result, broadband is the best chance that my daughter and hundreds of thousands of other children and adults across our country have to actually being able to lead healthy lives. We need to focus on creating sound policies and pathways that will enable more broadband access, broadband affordability, and universal connectivity. So it's not just about playing games and having this type of communication. These technologies are delivering real life solutions for our communities, for our families, our parents, and our children. And I know that personally. I get to work with companies and our members at US Telecom who are in the business of creating opportunities and are trying to do everything they can to connect communities everywhere, no matter what, no matter where. But we all know that the adoption rate of some of our digital tools, access to some of our digital infrastructure is lower in minority and low-income communities. And this is attributed to, I think, embedded structural and even systemic reasons. Affordability, digital literacy, lack of access to computers and to networks have been driving this challenge. And the numbers, are sobering. We know that 34% of Black adults, 39% of Latino adults, and fully 47%, almost half of those who are living on tribal lands don't have home broadband connections. Now, those are numbers that need to be solved. There are very specific steps that are realizable, that are right in front of us, that we need to get over the finish line right away. And it starts with things that might be considered by some as mundane, but are so critical, including we need to actually fund broadband maps, the next generation of broadband maps that will allow us to more accurately and more quickly and with more cost efficiency deliver the scarce broadband dollars that are through the broadband programs that our government provides to where they're needed most. We believe that we can take positive and practical steps to really think through how we can modernize and reinvent and make more purposeful and more efficient programs like Lifeline and E-rate and other mechanisms that exist to address our low-income communities, our schools, our anchor institutions, connect those who have not yet been able to get the right level of broadband connection in our higher cost, more rural communities. We can take positive steps to create a more digitally inclusive future.
My folks are the rural of the rural. They are in the places of the country where the large carriers, when they started off telephone service many, many years ago, chose not to build networks out to. And they chose not to build into those areas because they're very rural and they're high cost and they may be geographically challenging. So my folks actually were born out of necessity to ensure that those communities at that point had telephone service. We find on average, for example, that my company serve about 7 consumers per mile of wire. Here in the Washington, D.C. area where I work, we've got, the estimates range from 1,000 to 2,000, depending on how many apartment buildings you're including in that mile. And when you think about it, that infrastructure exactly the same, the software, the hardware, the fiber optics. The difference is the number of customers you have to spread that cost among, which is why it is so much more challenging and so much more expensive to actually build into these rural communities. We've now seen the evolution of going from telephone service to broadband connectivity. And that has been an exciting evolution. I will say, the first challenges that we had with broadband deployment We're getting rural consumers to actually understand the applications. When we first started rolling out, there were a lot of people who were like, oh, what do I need faster emails for? But understanding what that broadband piece can bring in terms of, again, things that we didn't even know before the pandemic. But, you're in a rural community and you may have 2 kids who are capable of or able to take advanced math. How do you pull those resources? How do we pull resources that we have at our fingertips in an urban area into these rural communities and really make a difference? And the thing that I love about the carriers that I represent, as I mentioned, 45 states, they cover about 38% of the landmass. So again, think about those areas when you're in an airplane and you look down and you're like, wow, there's just a lot of land out there. That's where my folks have infrastructure. But the thing I love is they're community-based. They live and they work in these communities. Their success is tied to the success of the towns that they live in. So if they are not going to provide the solutions, whether it's broadband, voice service, mobile service in a lot of cases, and certainly video services, there's nobody else who's going to come out there and do it. Their kids go to those schools. Their neighbors work in some of those local companies and on Main Street. So the feel of what they do and the passion behind it is so genuine and so day-to-day for them that it's really been fun, and it's honestly been a pleasure and an honor to work for them. That there's a whole part of rural America that's been left behind, and we have a lot of work to do as a country to connect those people. Right now, there's a lot of efforts out there to do that. There's a lot of initiatives. There's a lot of talk by policymakers, hopefully some programs getting stood up. But we've got people today who don't have connections. We've got kids today who are going to Taco Bell parking lots to do their homework. This is the United States of America. We've got to make sure that everybody has the opportunity and has access to the same opportunities. And we can't do that in a digital economy without making sure that broadband connections are there. So that is one piece of it. The other pieces I would say is there's affordability factor. One of the things that has been really important for my providers is access to government programs, because that's what makes broadband affordable. One of the things that I loved about working on the 96 Telecommunications Act was there's a very important provision in there that codified that all Americans should have comparable and affordable services. I live to that creed where we need to make sure that folks, regardless of their income level, have the capability to access. I think the other thing that's important, just being very frank, is there is a limited amount of government support. You've got the FCC with universal service and RDOF. You've also got USDA that for rural markets has been extraordinarily key as a banker to actually give loans and grants and loan grant combinations through not only the traditional broadband program, but through the new Reconnect program that Congress authorized about 1.5 years ago. That to date, by the end of the year, will put $1.2 billion into the ground, again, in unserved and in underserved parts of the country. Because those resources are so valuable, we've got to make sure that policymakers make the best use of it. Don't put these two programs in the same area to compete against each other. Don't let federal dollars compete against federal dollars for overbuilding when we've got so many people who don't have connections to begin with. So I know a lot of people like to default to competition's great. It'll bring the best services and prices. Yeah, that's a great concept. And that works here in Washington, D.C. If you are struggling to make a business case to put broadband in the first place in a rural, high-cost market, you know what? Competition not only doesn't work, it cannibalizes what you're trying to do, and it means there are fewer rural Americans that will be able to reach. You know what we don't do? We don't have the critical conversations. And I will say bringing these things closer to local communities is really where I see the magic happening, even if you bring it down to a state level. So while I think the federal government is really important in terms of resources, funding, some coordination, the areas that I have seen make the most progress on digital inclusion, capturing all communities within their area, are some of the states that have actually created broadband task forces. This is a way to get people who are boots closer to the ground, convening the right people for these discussions, whether it is diverse communities, whether it is rural citizens, whether it is those who are low-income individuals. When I see them sitting around the table at a state level, talking with superintendents of schools, talking about local health with local health providers. Those are the conversations that need to take place. And the other thing I think that is key there, states, and I will throw out the state of Minnesota, for example, has a border-to-border program. They are exemplary. They make sure that every community has a voice at that table. And then they look at a map and they map out where's broadband not, what is the affordability factor, and then say, what can we do as a state to plug these gaps and figure it out? When it comes to, whoops, we're finding out in September, kids aren't going to be able to go back to school. What the role the state has been able to play to say, all right, which school children aren't connected? And if it's affordability, how do we work with the providers to connect them at their home? And how do we make it affordable for those families during this crisis time?
Broadband deployment has probably been the fastest deploying technology in the history of the world. And so we have much to celebrate in terms of how many people we reached and how quickly. But is always true with network infrastructure because of the economics, it gets really hard when you get to that last portion of the population. That was true with electricity, that's true with indoor plumbing and water, it's true with roads, it's true with almost every network infrastructure. I think it's smart to realize there's two kind of distinct problems caught up in the terms of digital divide, digital inclusion. We like to say digital equity. The first is people who don't even have the infrastructure to begin with. They are unserved. The network's yet to reach them. This is essentially a network economic problem of enormous proportions. Put simply, if I got to run a wire between two homes that are 300 miles apart to pick up two customers paying $50 a month, that is a heinous economic equation that's just insurmountable by most economic and financial models. So to reach the unserved it necessitates the power of the government being a partner with private sector in how to close that gap, because we're talking about there's only two ways to solve that problem, which are find more revenue, find more money to offset the enormous expense of reaching those people, or lower the costs. And you can lower the costs through technology, you can lower the costs through lower regulatory barriers, you can lower the costs other ways. But the big issue in this case is the sort of scary sums of money that would be required to get to 100%. The second problem is also encompassed in your concerns, but they're distinct. They're what I would call the adoption and affordability issues. Communities that have the infrastructure available to them, but nonetheless don't subscribe. We've been looking at that problem for 2 decades, and it is more complex than the first. It is littered with a myriad of explanations. One is we're surprised, no matter how different we think about it, how many people say they don't value the service enough to purchase it. Whether that's true in an exercise of free choice, or whether it's also because they don't fully appreciate the essentiality of it to being full participants in society. The other aspect of it is affordability. Even though I think the rates are generally pretty good, they're expensive for some people and some families. And that particularly affects urban poor, where we find a lot of communities of color. It affects low-income families. It affects large families who have limited disposable income. But also, to get on the internet means you have to have the equipment. You have to have devices. You have to have a laptop. You have to have an iPad. You have to have a Wi-Fi router. You have to have a modem. It's not a simple, one device solution. So, we have that part of the problem. And then finally, I think the most underappreciated problem is the skills required to be effective. I remember in the early days of the internet, opening up a web browser and staring at the page and not really having the slightest idea what to do, where to go, what to experience. I think we take for granted that this thing is a pretty passive medium if you don't know what you're doing. It'll just stare at you. And I think we have to be committed to helping people develop the skills and the education necessary to take full advantage of these services. So all the programs that we're involved in, both on our own and in partnership with the government or other community organizations, is around these two buckets. On the unserved, it's really a question of stronger government partnerships and greater flow of consistent capital. This is where Congress could do more. This is where the FCC does a lot, but it's far short of the numbers that would seriously take us to the next level. Adoption and affordability, I think, one, there's an education effort around value, but on the affordability side, I think it's incumbent for the country to think about how do you provide low-income access affordability programs. Our industry is proud of what we do in this regard. Almost all of our companies have a low-income program, on average offering broadband around $9.95, $10 a month. But the government has programs as well. And I think one of the things this country's never quite grappled with is broadband going to be part of the social safety net? You know, the way that we provide unemployment insurance or SNAP or the ability for people to feed each other, if we believe that this is an essential service, are we going to find a way to include some sort of support for those who are down on their luck or out of work or are struggling with the expenses associated with the service? I'm proud of my industry that we might have passed the social test too. You know, I remember turning to the CEOs of our industry and I said, this has to be our finest hour. Our country is really in need here, and we need to find ways to step up. And right from the beginning, when Chairman Pai called on the industry to keep America connected, we were immediately there. And in fact, the cable industry took a lead position in arguing that that pledge should continue throughout the school year, so we could get our kids to the summer break effectively. But we kept people on the network. We didn't disconnect people. That was an important commitment. More importantly, I think we expanded our low-income access programs. We gave consumers free service for 60 days. Many of our companies, we increased speeds, we increased eligibility. We have Wi-Fi hotspots all over the United States. The industry opened up those Wi-Fi spots for free to all consumers, all citizens, all users. And the area we're focused most heavily on now is schools. We announced a big initiative called Bridge to Broadband in partnership with Education Superhighway to create a discounted offering that schools could purchase on behalf of all their unserved students, so the students themselves would have little to no expense associated with going to school remotely. Companies like Comcast have done lift zones where they're putting industrial grade Wi-Fi inside boys and girls clubs and community centers for people. Many of our companies have extended free periods of use, and many have made big financial commitments. Cox recently announced a $60 million commitment to helping schools and students learn remotely. So these are some of the things we've done. I think we're proud of how we've performed so far in COVID, but I think we're also very sober that we don't think COVID's going away tomorrow, and that we're constantly looking for better ways to help the country with one of its greatest challenges we've ever experienced. We've also really doubled down on the idea that we have to be part of the community. We have to be in the community. I think the schools thing has really led us to be present, to be, you know, in communion with superintendents, with community activists, with local leaders, with groups like yours to try to better understand the problems and create more wraparound services to help. You know, if I were to sum it up, you know, I've often said this as a Black American myself. I think the promise of there's sort of been three great revolutions in the history of mankind: the agricultural age, the industrial age, and now the information age. I think the information age is the first and only real opportunity a lot of people, particularly people of color, have had any opportunity to enjoy the fruits of that advance. You know, my relatives were picking cotton in the agricultural era. You know, my ancestors were living in legally segregated societies during the majority of the industrial era. This is the first era that may hold genuine promise for us. And I think there really is no future that you can see that isn't rooted in technology. And I think to be a full participant in that future, we got to overcome a lot of barriers in our communities: education, poverty and wealth disparities, access. You know, and in our world, in cable, you know, we're working to provide the essential tools that folks need to get in the game. But how well they play in that game is going to depend on attacking the chronic problems that stem from a history of racial and gender inequality. You know, in a way, just because you're handed a baseball bat doesn't mean, you know, you're prepared to be a good hitter in the major leagues. And so, I want our society to see this as a big, comprehensive problem, part of the systematic racism work, part of the growing inequality work, so that we can create a community of people that not only have the tools, but have the skills, the coaching, the training that's necessary to actually succeed and perform well. And if we do that, it's a pretty exciting future for all of our citizens. If we don't do that, we're going to further exacerbate dramatically the inequalities that continue to plague American society. I think creating a spirit of partnership rather than adversarial environment, this is not a solution anybody's going to fix by yelling at anybody. We have to get all the providers in the game. In our industry, we continue to be super frustrated by the legacy of telephone regulation and the fact that as we try to tackle broadband, so many of these programs have requirements and qualifications that keep people off the field. The cable industry really wants to get deeper into the game of reaching people, but sometimes we find out that in order to get this money for this program, you have to be an eligible telecom carrier. You have to be something that's a vestige of old regulations that's just prohibitive. So we need Congress to remove barriers like that. The last two things I'd say, Alejandro, is we need to involve big tech more. The telecom companies and the broadband companies are central to this. But you know what? There's another class of providers who've profited massively from the internet tech revolution, who are in the schools, who provide and sell devices, who are an enormously wealthy component of the problem, who have to be part of the solution. I'd like to see us find more creative ways to get big tech on the team for solving this and sharing in the burden and the expense of how to fix it. Then finally, as I think I alluded to in my earlier comments, we need people like you. This needs a community collective action support system. If there's a low-income family or Hispanic family or Latinx family living in Brooklyn somewhere, and we get them the service and we get them a device, if we just walk away from them and there isn't a community infrastructure that will help with education, skills, tech support, all kinds of other things, then we're sort of kidding ourselves we're making the world better for them. We're just sort of handing them a car sometimes that they don't fully know how to drive.
Broadband has never been more important or more relevant to our national dialogue. Well over half of Hispanic Americans report broadband being more important to their lives today. Mine too. The pandemic has showcased that access to broadband is critical. Industry, community groups, and policymakers must work together to ensure all Americans are connected. HTTP has been a powerful ally and voice in this fight. The wireless industry is committed to the task as well. I know this because of what I have seen over the past 6 months. Like many of you, I went home on March 13th. We closed CTIA for 2 weeks. 2 weeks! Fast forward a lot more than that, and our lives have fundamentally changed. One constant? Our smartphones. Now, more than ever, our smartphone is our lifeline, keeping us connected with family, work, school, and even our doctors. I'm proud we were ready when America needed us. As you have powerfully pointed out, the digital divide has never been more stark. COVID has magnified the divide in opportunities between those connected and unconnected. As a nation, we must do more to address affordability, access, and other adoption challenges. There is no silver bullet. We need to work together to solve rural and urban coverage, to ensure government programs address affordability, and to solve the digital literacy and device access challenges we have today. I've been blown away by the response of the wireless industry trying to meet the needs of kids. In the spring, our operators jumped into action. A wireless hotspot has proven to be the fastest and most effective way to get kids online. Verizon partnered with the LA Unified School District and, in the words of the state's superintendent, helped close the digital divide in the country's second largest school district. AT&T provides 60 days of free service for qualifying schools and recently delivered 11,000 hotspots in San Jose alone. Most recently, T-Mobile announced its 10 million project, which will provide free service and a free device to 10 million eligible households. All remarkable. But the commitment didn't end there. We helped feed hungry kids, and we invested in new curriculum and resources. Each day, a new problem revealed itself, and the U.S. wireless industry was ready to do its part to help. At CTIA, we created the Connected Kids Initiative to link school districts with providers in their community ready to help. Our collective efforts have provided new connectivity for over 2 million kids across the country. They are online right now because of the proactive efforts of the U.S. wireless industry. Wireless solutions have become the go-to answer for school leaders seeking an easy-to-use option for families. We have proven crucial to the most at-risk kids, as wired solutions can be a poor fit for students without a permanent home. Chicago identified the pressing need for wireless solutions to help 12,000 homeless kids keep learning this fall. Reach out to see if CARES funding is available to help bridge the gap. Use the Connected Kids portal to seek help. The same collaborative approach applies equally to all of our nation's digital divide challenges. We must be practical and resourceful. We must be partners. We can't let another year pass without reducing the number of Americans without connectivity. And this goes beyond a pandemic. All Americans need to benefit from the 5G economy we are building right now. It is critical to our nation's recovery.
I will go forward for my land and my legacy. Onward, forward, creating our destiny. Our past made history. I feel it in my soul and in my memory. My community lifts me higher, and I will go forward together with them.
You have the power to inspire the world. We connect you to everything that helps you move forward.
Hi, HTTP. I'm watching a Digital Inclusion Summit from home, and I'm super excited about all the conversations you all are going to have related to broadband access and affordability, diversity in tech, as well as the future of work.
Congratulations to the Hispanic Telecommunications and Technology Partnership for organizing your inaugural Digital Inclusion Summit. This discussions and these that are taking place during the event could not have come at a more perfect time, because not only are we in the midst of a digital age, we are in the midst of a moment of unprecedented uncertainty due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This time period has placed the importance of access to affordable, reliable broadband front and center. Our Latinx, Black, and Indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted by the lack of access to broadband and the devices needed to navigate the internet. This issue is systemic, and we must meet the moment because no one in this country should be sitting on sidewalks outside of a restaurant or in their hot cars in the parking lot to learn or work remotely. Our economy, democracy, and the personal dignity of those who are unable to participate in the digital age because of geographic location or socioeconomic status are all impacted when our communities are not connected. But as HTTP has mentioned, it's not simply access to broadband that creates or sustains a digitally inclusive society. We must ensure these tools can be used to empower our most vulnerable communities. Our policies must help shape the ground and the future of work to ensure Latinos are able to grow and sustain their businesses in a changing economy. And for those who are at the most risk of losing their jobs due to automation, we must work to reskill and upskill those individuals so that they can continue to provide for their families. Lastly, we have to ensure that diverse voices are represented in the tech and telecom space. We can't create an inclusive future without technologists and policymakers who understand the needs of our communities. That's why I created the Early Career Staff Diversity Initiative at the FCC, so that we can recruit students from Hispanic serving institutions, HBCUs, and other communities of color to participate in our internship, attorney honors, and engineering programs. I'd love to see those efforts modeled throughout the public and private sectors because, as HTTP says, the future is digital, and the voices are diverse, and the impact is personal. Thank you.
My name is Amy Hinojosa, and I'm the president and CEO of MANA, a national Latina organization. MANA is a national grassroots membership organization with chapters, individual members, and affiliates across the country. We represent the interests of Latina women, youth, and families on issues that impact our communities. We contribute the leading Latina voice on many of the major issues in the public sphere, particularly in the areas of education, health and well-being, financial literacy, equal and civil rights, and immigration reform. Our chapters and affiliates provide programming locally to educate and empower our communities nationwide. Our values are rooted in serving the community through leadership development, educational workshops, mentoring the next generation of leaders, and building the structures to support continued Latina success. MANA fundamentally believes that education and access to technology are central to building the strength of our communities nationwide. We are committed to closing the digital divide, providing equal access to educational opportunities, advocating for appropriate educational funding, protecting students from hate speech and bullying in all forms, and promoting STEM education. This means we want to see equal treatment and protection across the internet ecosystem, the preservation of constitutional principles online, the protection of personal privacy, safe user experiences, the end of algorithmic discrimination, closing the digital divide, of course, and then diversity in all areas of tech. 1 in 5 women in the United States today is Latina. By 2060, that number will be 1 in 3. This is why it is so important for us to join our fellow members of HTTP to use our collective voice to bring our issues and our place in these conversations to light. Latinos are the workforce of the present and the future. So now is the time for us to insist upon equity in the sector. This is why we're so excited to have this conversation for you today. And now I'm going to turn it over to the HTTP Executive Director, Alejandro Rourke, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Amy, and to our friends at MANA. As we discuss the importance of working together to promote durable connectivity solutions, we would be remiss if we didn't directly acknowledge the important role that representational leadership at all levels of government, media, and in the tech workforce plays in achieving our inclusive tech future that benefits everyone. Foundational to our ability to create digital tools, culturally responsive digital skills education, and to shaping the public perception and shared understanding of the lives, experiences, and contributions of communities of color is creating spaces and tables where we are able to speak for ourselves and on our own terms and through our own unique prism, which is colored by the way that we experience the world. Achieving our goal of an inclusive digital future requires an all-hands-on-deck approach, because it is only when we are able to harness the best of what each of us can bring to the table that we can effectively break through the intellectual glass ceilings currently limiting the power of our collective genius. Today, I have the opportunity of sitting down with April Rain, creator and founder of #OscarsSoWhite, Lucy Flores, former Nevada Assemblywoman and CEO of the Luz Collective, Alberto Mejia, Deputy Director for NALAC, the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture, Victor Dueñas, writer and producer for the film Bibi, and Ana Flores, founder of Wheel Girl Latina, to share why they think representation is critical to our economy and for our society and to the future of everything.
Thank you to you, Alejandro, and HTTP for having me here today on this amazing panel. In January of 2015, I was still a practicing attorney, and I was practicing campaign finance law. I had absolutely no nexus to the entertainment industry other than I was an avid movie watcher, and so the Oscars were like my Super Bowl. There were special snacks involved. I would rope off the TV, so everybody knew this was mommy's night. And after the nominations came out, I would actually attempt to see all of the Best Picture and Best Actor and Best Actress films so that I could really talk my stuff, afterwards and say who was wrong or, that something was well-deserved. So in that morning, January 2015, I was getting ready for work and I was down in my family room because one of the presenters of the nominations, the Oscar nominations that year, was Thor, Chris Hemsworth from the Avengers series. And I said, hey, Thor is going to be in a 3-piece suit. I need him on the biggest TV we have in the house in HD. So here I am putting on my skirt while sitting on the couch. And it struck me, category after category, there were no people of color nominated in any of the acting categories. And let's remember, this is 20 slots. Best actress, best actor, best actress, best supporting actor, best supporting actress, 0. And this was the year that gave us Selma, that gave us Beyond the Lights. So it wasn't as if there weren't quality performances. And so I picked up my phone, being sarcastic, as I very often am on Twitter, and I said, Oscar so white, they asked to touch my hair. And that was it. This was an organic thing. I was being snarky and I went on to work. I checked in on Twitter around lunchtime and the hashtag based on that one tweet was trending around the world. And then I had to figure out if I was going to continue this conversation that people were having, if I wanted to be the leader of whatever this thing was. And so one of the things I'll say to people is that, you have to choose. You have to choose if you're going to be the face of something when something may go unintentionally viral, or, there have been times when I've had tweets that I've intended to go viral and they have. And then it's like, okay, well, what do you do with that momentum? Who do you talk to? What do you learn? What is your goal, right? And so one has to be prepared in determining, now that you've got the floor, what are you going to say, and what are your goals? And that's absolutely true with respect to tech policy. Once we get that opportunity to have a seat at the table or demand such, we need to make sure that we're ready to go with a plan, with an outcome. And so now what we see 6 years later, as you mentioned, the Academy made some changes. We can have an argument about whether they were actually worth anything. But what I think is more important is that people, consumers like you and me are being more savvy and intentional about our choices with respect to entertainment. And I think the same thing is happening in tech. We're realizing now that we have much more power and we're thinking about how we're going to spend our hard-earned dollars, whether, post-pandemic, in an actual movie theater or right now with streaming services. Same thing with tech, right? There's nobody that is doing it all by themselves. And so consumers realize that they have choices. And so those companies, the industries, the brands need to be thinking about how they are best representing the demographic that they want to reach, right? And that has to start at the top. You cannot have middle managers who are saying, yes, Black Lives Matter, Brown Lives Matter, we get it, we want to be on board. And then the C-suite is an incredibly homogenous group, typically of white men who are not providing the support and the resources, meaning money, to actually make the changes that are necessary. We can no longer wait for the big studios, the Paramounts, the Universals, the 20th centuries to make this change, because what we know is that diversity and representation sell. And we can look at movies like Coco and Crazy Rich Asians and Black Panther as just some recent examples of how that's true. The more diverse a project is in entertainment or any industry, the more money it makes, especially if we're talking about both in front of and behind the camera. So those bigger studios who are not being more intentional with respect to inclusion are literally leaving money on the table at this point. And so what I think is really interesting is watching content creators, right? But in this case, we're talking about actors and producers and directors who are making their own tables, no longer waiting for a seat at the table at the bigger studios, but creating their own production companies. Obviously we have Ava DuVernay as the prototype with all of this. But we also have people like Michael B. Jordan, who created Outlier Society Productions, and others who are creating the art that they want to see for the audiences that they want to reach. And so, yes, absolutely. Studios can do more. Congress can do more. The inclusion rider is out there. That would be a great way to say, you know what? you're not going to get this funding, right? Because it all comes down to money. You're not going to get this funding unless you're intentional about who is in front of and behind the camera. And again, we're looking for quality individuals. This is not checking off a box to ensure that you've got, one queer person and one Latinx person and so on. This is about ensuring that there are more opportunities for traditionally underrepresented communities. A lot of the jobs behind the camera, the gaffers, the key grips, the production supervisors are covered by a union. Well, you have to have so much experience on film before you can come into the union, right? But how do you get that experience if you can't get hired because you're not part of the union? And so Congress can work on some of those issues as well. There is a lot that can be done. These things could have happened decades ago. This didn't just start, 5 years ago with Oscar So White. But I'm encouraged by the fact that there are some who are taking this into their own hands and making concrete change.
I'd like to talk about the work of the organization and how we sort of conceive representation and why art matters. And then I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I think that what I want to share is, NALAC is what I like to call a full spectrum intermediary. We're a nonprofit organization. So the way that we fulfill the mission that you shared is really through membership-based work of a giant network of Latinx artists, cultural workers, administrators, lovers of art across the nation, Puerto Rico. Also, we have leadership programs that focus on developing arts leaders, arts advocates, and policymakers. And we're a partnership with some other organizations and Intercultural Leadership Institute. We've also got our grant-making programs, which are, our standard program focuses on funding a diverse array of Latinx arts. We've also got some really exciting programs that are focused on shifting the narrative around the border areas and also interrupting, challenging, transforming, racist systems as they show up in communities. So those are some of our grant-making opportunities. And of course, we engage in research and advocacy. So I just kind of wanted to paint the full picture of what we do and who we serve. When we think about why representation, I think, is so important, I think of three key words. I think of the words accountability, abundance, and alchemy. And, I think that the common parlance, and when we talk about this type of work, is, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And I think this is not a jab at the practitioners that are out there in that world, but I think that with 30 years of doing this work focused on the Latinx cultural arts field and all its diasporic diversity, that really, I think it's more about accountability and justice, right? I think that's where it starts. We're kind of, I think, evolving in some ways past the era of firsts. And so as Latinx cultural workers and lovers and supporters, it's really important that we have the conversations to achieve justice and accountability within our own community. And that includes, making sure that Indigenous and Black Latinx folks are, front and center in this work. So that way, it's truly accountable so that when we have an abundance in any, part of the sector, that we're really bringing our full beauty and power with us. We're not leaving folks behind, It's easy to see that, even amongst ourselves in spaces of Hispanic or Latinx leadership, there is colorism. There is our own unchecked colorism, bias, and racism in our communities that we are in a time where we can address. So that when we have abundance, it's actually genuine and meaningful where we move into these spaces. And then what I think is possible is alchemy. We can actually have real transformation. We might have a country that actually funds its, national arts at an adequate level. I'm pretty sure that, the city of Berlin's arts budget dwarfs, the NEA funding, and that's tragic. It's just a straight tragedy. So that when we get to that level of abundance, we have it grounded in some real genuine change. And I would say that as far as the importance of art and culture itself is that my notion is that it's where we as human beings, as community, where we make and produce meaning with one another. I think that, you asked a little bit about my pathway. I was a hip hop performing artist and a teaching artist prior to becoming, arts administration and a wonky policy person. And what struck me, then and now is that art is deeply personal. And culture is the most intimate space we really can share as human beings, and in some cases, some people are so socially or personally traumatized that doing a poem with them, writing a play, dancing, moving, that can be the medicine that they need to take care of their own basic needs. I think back to being a case manager and working with young people where they wouldn't be motivated to even show up to school, go to the collect food at our little food bank we had in the school site. What got them to that point was art and culture and that connection that's created. It paves the way for real transformation,
For me, identity has always been super critical and a part of everything that I do. When I first decided to run for office in Nevada, I very much ran as a Latina, as a young woman, as all of the identities that I bring to the table, not because I should be judged on those things, but because there is almost no representation at every moment that we look around. And so because we are so critically underrepresented, it's almost like we have to lead with our identity in order to make ourselves known in those spaces and to be those voices as loud as we possibly can for the rest of our community.
For me, Alejandro, representation is important because it really gives us a sense of how we feel about ourselves. The way that we look at ourselves as a community, as individuals, is a lot of times formed by what we see on television, for better or for worse, and on film. And so, to me, the fact that we are able to represent ourselves accurately and with a variety of voices is everything. In my case, I was very blessed to have this opportunity to be on this show, Islos High, which was the second show that Hulu had basically taken on as a Hulu original series. And so the fact that we had the opportunity, because of technology, because of this sort of pioneering media, to show America who we were in a very authentic way, not something that was the typical tropes or stereotypes. We didn't have any gang members, maids or gardeners. Not that there's anything wrong with that part of our community, but what the showrunner wanted to do was expand what America knew of our community. So I think it really made a difference in the way, and just by the response that we got from many of the fans and critics and the like, I think we really did a really great job of introducing different voices. And I really, credit technology for doing that. I don't think we could have done what we did on Islos High had Hulu not existed and had streaming services not really sort of taken on this sort of mission of creating original programming. So I think it was, the importance of representation in media is everything. And so, yeah, I think we're in a really great point right now to further that, to take that further. I think that moving forward, one of the things that really is going to take our community to the next level is really the internet and broadband specifically, because the internet allows people from not only our community locally, wherever we live in the US or abroad, to gain information, but really anywhere in the world. It's a very valuable tool for democratizing information. And I think that one of the things that, for example, our community here in Hollywood did was on the heels of the Emmy nominations, and a letter out to Hollywood, an open letter to Hollywood, was written by many of us in the community called the #EndLatinx Exclusion Letter. And this one document that really talked about the issues really standing in the way of Latinos and the Latinx community really having more of a say in the kind of programming that exists, was a really incredible sort of waking moment for us all. The letter went viral. It was picked up by all the outlets. It was written about by CNN and Hollywood Reporter and Variety and everyone else. And so I think again, that wouldn't have been possible if it hadn't been for the internet and broadband. And so I think we're at a very great place to sort of take the next steps in bringing more of our voices to the fold of Hollywood. And there's a lot of organizations here in Hollywood that are really trying to find more voices outside of what we normally would see, the people that are already the regular players and such. And it's great. It's a great moment for young Latinx filmmakers and writers and creators to really be involved. And I credit that to the internet.
I was born in Texas. My parents are from El Salvador. My mom moved back to El Salvador, so I grew up between both countries, visiting my dad in Texas every year. That really helped to form my identity because, of course, I was always a Salvadoreña, but I was always a Salvadoreña living the experience in the U.S. and this bicultural, bilingual person, right, where I didn't really feel I fit in, which is a lot of the narrative and a lot about Latinos feel. And when I not only that, but I was not the traditional person that wanted to do what in El Salvador was expected, which was to become a wife or, inherit something or, launching your business and all that wasn't really where you fit in. And I wanted to study media and television. So I moved back to the States and I did that. And I have always lived in creating content for Latinos. So I actually have never had a job where I'm not working with the Latinx community. It started with Univision and then MTV Latin America and Mexico, and then here with Mundos, which is now NBC Universo, until really it's always creating content, always talking to Latinos and creating content by and for us, but in the different perspectives of Latin America, and then creating content for U.S. Hispanics, which we know is different, but that afforded me this bigger global view of how we identify, right? That as we all know here, and we've said a lot during Hispanic and Latinx Heritage Month, right, that we're not a monolithic group, that we're not a homogeneous group. But it's easy to say that, but then what does that mean? Especially if you're coming from digital media, if you're coming from brands, so you're trying to speak to all of these communities at once, right? And try to capture. So how do we talk in cultura? How do we create that? And I've been afforded through my life experience. I really feel that knowledge has just embedded in me. And when I became a mom and I had quit my job, and I love telling this part of the story because it is powerful. I quit my job and the recession came. I had no idea. And I was out of work because I had quit my job and my husband had lost everything too. But what I turned into was the digital space, blogs. This was 2008, 2009. The digital space, what's important about what tech has been able to do specifically for our communities was that it has been able to democratize our voices. Blogging did just that. It allowed a mom out of work, almost in food stamps, in LA, trying to survive in LA with no family around me, to be able to create a space where not only it became a community to me, but it became a community to those women around, of women that needed it as well, and parents, which was my blog. I was a mommy blogger, which was my blog called Spanglish Baby for parents raising bilingual and bicultural kids. So what I did was that I didn't look, I didn't have to do research, I didn't have to do data. I knew what I, as a Latina mom, needed, which was the resources for me that I wanted my daughter to stay connected to her roots and learn the language as I had done at an early age, right? And I wasn't finding those resources. So as many of us have done and continue to do, I created my own table. I knew how to create content that spoke to us and by us. So I just continued doing that and I didn't need money because thanks to the digital tools, I could create a blog with $10, right, to host a site and really just our experience. And that just grew. I became a well-known mommy blogger at the time, but that allowed me to open the door, right, to open the doors into these brands that wanted to learn more about how to reach Latina moms. Because we had to find a way, we were reaching ourselves, right? We were creating that community. And that just expanded then to what is now We All Grow, because I launched Latina Bloggers Connect, which was the first network connecting Latina bloggers with brands. And really, I didn't understand back then truly the impact of what I was creating, because for me, it was, I need to make sure that we can all continue doing this and using this space. And to do that, we need to monetize. And obviously, if I was going to go to anyone to try to raise funds 10 years ago, as a mom blogger with the idea of trying to connect Latina bloggers and to allow us to continue sharing our stories, no one was opening the door for me.
AT&T nos ha conectado cada día por más de 100 años y estamos aquí para apoyarte, especialmente ahora, haciendo todo lo posible por mantenerte conectado. Con la fuerza de nuestra red y nuestra gente, podemos seguir aprendiendo, seguir compartiendo y más que nada, seguir juntos. Es lo que siempre hemos hecho y lo que haremos siempre.
As we heard in our last segment, the cornerstone of this year's Digital Inclusion Summit is the idea that representation and representational leadership matters. It matters in government, it matters in news media, it matters in entertainment, and it matters at every decision-making table. I have the pleasure of sitting down with former FCC Commissioner Mignon Clyburn as a part of our kitchen table conversations on race, technology, and the future of everything. Mignon is someone who has been blazing trails her entire career and has been doing the work to help create a truly inclusive tech future by showing up, speaking up, and by holding the door open for the next generation of digital inclusion advocates. Mignon Clyburn served as commissioner on the Federal Communications Commission from 2009 to 2018, including a term as acting chairwoman in 2013. During her service, she was committed to closing the digital divide and championed the modernization of the agency Lifeline program, which assists low-income consumers with voice and broadband service. She championed greater diversity in media ownership, initiated inmate calling service reforms, and fought for an open internet. Mignon, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. You continue to have an impressive career and have become a model for how we can all be more effective advocates for greater inclusion and equity in tech and telecommunications policy. Do you mind sharing a little bit about your background, what got you started on this path, and what fuels your passion for tech and telecommunications policy?
Thanks for having me. I think if you wanted to get a greater understanding of my regulatory DNA, look at my organic or more robustful DNA. I am the eldest of two parents who met during the civil rights movement. They met on campus coming out of jail on the campus of South Carolina State College, now university, in the late 50s. They forged this relationship, and our home was very regularly visited by those from all walks of life who believed in equity and justice, who did not mind risking much, no matter the race, because there were as many non-African Americans in our home than African Americans. They risked it all for a better South Carolina, for a better America. I was that kid, hiding behind the seats, getting found out, because back then a lot of people smoked. So I would get discovered, so to speak, as I was choking on, on the cigarette fumes. But I was listening and learning and absorbing what was going on and why it was going on. And that influenced me and given the opportunity to serve in government, first in South Carolina, then at the FCC. And I recognize how powerful and how much government can do to repair faults, to take care of breaches, and to be that critical backstop for communities that have been on the wrong side of the opportunities divide. So one could say, if I were to look more cosmically, so to speak, that I was made for those moments. But I will say that my upbringing and the people who supported and uplifted me had at their essence the willingness to help others who are not similarly situated and to use your talents to open more doors of opportunity.
When you worked on the FCC, they have great programs to help every American participate in our 21st century economy, like the Lifeline program, the E-rate program, their newly established Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And so I guess a question for you would be, from your vantage point, do these programs go far enough? And what more could Congress or the FCC do to extend the positive impact of these programs so that they reach more people?
On paper, they are incredibly aspirational. The differences are often by interpretation and implementation when it comes to these programs. Take one program that is near and dear to me, the Lifeline program, which has the incredible potential to bridge the communications gap for those who are on the other side of the economic divide. When I was still a member of the commission, one of the things I did surprised a number of people. I asked for the commission to look at itself in the Lifeline program to see if and how it could be reformed. You know, at the time, people were like, "You're wanting to reform and look at and evaluate a program. You're a Democrat." I'm also a person that believes in good governance. And so I think any program, no matter how well-intentioned, should occasionally look at itself and see if it's meeting the needs of the community. So we determined collectively that the Lifeline program needed to be reconstituted, so to speak, for the information age. So we pushed for as a part of that product that broadband should be a part of that supplement, or should be a part of that monthly reimbursement to those companies, to allow that to be a part of a subscriber's future, that it should be a part of the mix when it comes to you deciding exactly what you want, be it mobile or not service. It should not just be voice only, because we do not live in a voice only world.
How would you contrast the regulatory approach of the FCC during President Trump's first term? And as we look to the results of this year's election, what do you think that we can expect in a new Biden-Harris administration?
You probably know I have a political DNA also. And so if I'm a little bit more coy or a little bit more punchy elsewhere, you will either forgive me or understand me. I will approach it by saying this. If you notice my last year and a half or two as an FCC commissioner, I was often on the other side of my colleagues. The majority of my colleagues, I was. I really felt that their DNA was more skewed to big business, not enough in terms of consumer needs and protections. Not enough for innovation and competition when it comes to these as scrappy providers who wanted to serve niche communities that needed connectivity the most. And I think I keep going back to the Lifeline and more reforms in E-rate of the schools and libraries programs. And I'm a little more in tune and with the current administration when it comes to the rural health initiatives. A lot of that was built collaboratively. But on the other two, I am severely disappointed because if we were more proactive, the devastation of the pandemic, I think in many parts of this nation would have been more smooth. So, to me, when if I were to forecast, I would say that we're going to be forced to address the needs of those on the wrong side of the telecommunications, technology, and opportunities divide. This pandemic is going to force whoever is inaugurated on a 21st of January, assuming I have the date right, is going to force us to do so, because not doing so is going to be too much more of an economic drain on our economy. So regardless of politics, we're going to be forced to do more in terms of implementation. Not to forecast what I'm going to do in about a week or two. I haven't voted yet. I believe that there is a quicker, more robust path forward with a particular candidate. As close as I will get to the line, I've seen the plans of both campaigns, and I think there is one over the other that speaks to the needs of those on the wrong side of the communications and opportunities divide.
Broadband is fueling a revolution in how and where we work. Charter is delivering reliable, high-speed Spectrum Internet access to more Americans, connecting 1.5 million new homes and businesses in the past 2 years alone, about a third in rural areas, empowering opportunity from coast to coast. Charter is keeping us connected.
Hey HTTP, it's Jessica Rosenworcel from the Federal Communications Commission, and I wanted to congratulate you on your first ever Digital Inclusion Summit. I think the future belongs to the connected. No matter who you are or where you live, you need access to modern communications to have a fair shot at 21st century success. And this cruel pandemic has really proved that point, because it used to be that we talked about broadband as nice to have, but I think we've demonstrated conclusively its need to have. So we need policies now to make sure 100% of our households have access to affordable broadband. 100%. We did it before with electricity. We did it before with access to water. We've got to figure out how to do it with access to the internet. So we need all your good ideas. Keep us posted. Let us know what they are. I don't think every good idea will come from my agency or from Washington. It'll come from conversations like this. So I can't wait to learn what you discussed today. Tell me more. Know that my office is always open to your ideas, because we're going to need lots of them to make sure that we get to reach everyone in this country and make sure we are all digitally included.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cindy Benavides, and I serve as the Chief Executive Officer of the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC. LULAC is the oldest and largest national Latino civil rights organization in the country. We were created in 1929 in Corpus Christi, Texas, to protect and defend our Latino community. And since then, we've expanded into 41 states, Puerto Rico, and Washington, D.C. And today, we continue to touch upon all the important issues that impact our comunidad, nuestra comunidad latina, aquí en los Estados Unidos. I am a proud member of the Technology and Telecommunications Partnership, HTTP, and so proud to call Alejandro a friend and colleague doing this very important work amid especially this global pandemic. So what has LULAC been up to? Well, I would say that what haven't we been doing? And during this global pandemic, LULAC has been helping our community increase awareness around COVID-19 through our Ayuda en Español toolkit, and by partnering with partners across the entire U.S. to make sure that we're addressing some of the greatest issues in our comunidad, including food and financial insecurity. Right now, we're in the middle of executing different events across 8 major cities in the US to make sure that our comunidad has access to food. And we're so proud to be able to do this through the network of grassroots volunteers that we have across this country. When it comes to the work around technology, we're also very proud to be fighting on multiple fronts and also advocating on multiple fronts. For one, what this global pandemic has exposed is that 1 in 3 Latinos still lack access to technology and broadband. And so LULAC has partnered to make sure that our comunidad, our elderly, our students, and our community in general has access to laptops to be able to do their schoolwork, but also to stay in touch and communicate with their loved ones and members. We know how important technology is, and we know how vital it is that so many of us have access to broadband, and that's why we are engaged and involved. In terms of programs, LULAC is always at the forefront, and we understood years before today that access to technology was an issue. Specifically, our former CEO, Brent Wilkes, helped to start our Empower Hispanic America with technology. And since the beginning of our tech program, we now have 68 technology centers across America to make sure that our community has access to these different labs, which oftentimes are in the heart of our communities and which are accessible not only to the parents, but to the students and to general community members. We're also happy to partner with Google on Grow with Google and make sure we're uplifting those resources and programs for all community members. And we also have our Latina Entrepreneur Academy, and because of this pandemic, we have shifted so many of our programming online, which has meant that LULAC has taken an additional effort and step to make sure that our community has that access to technology and is also technology literate, which is very important that we understand and that we continue to expand. And lastly, a program that's really close to my heart is Tecnolochicas Lift, which is making sure that we continue to build that pipeline of Latinas going into STEAM fields, into technology. We know that Latinas are massively underrepresented in this field. And through Tecnolochicas Lift, our hope is to build that pipeline by starting in middle school and making sure that our Latinas that are still in school consider this as a potential career and pathway in the future. So we're really, really proud of that. I will tell you that the policy issues that impact not all of America, but really all of America, including individuals who live in rural communities, is really close to our heart, understanding that oftentimes Latinos also live across the stretch of our great country, including parts that are rural. And so on this front, LULAC has been advocating for rural broadband, understanding that making sure that we reach all communities during this pandemic and during this time is important as we see the development expansion of technology here in America, but also the future of work, which most oftentimes is transitioning to online and also much more heavy tech skills that our community needs to have. And so in the area of rural broadband, LULAC continues to look for additional partners. Recently, we've been working with our meatpacking and poultry industry to advocate for rural broadband, as many of their plants are located in rural areas. We're also very happy to be a part of the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Council at the FCC and continue to advocate for issues that impact our Latino community. Alejandro, the issue of technology and broadband is an issue that for us, it's very close to our heart. And so as we think of the panel that's going to be having this really important conversation around free speech, hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, and voter suppression, we know that these are critical issues that are impacting our community right now. In fact, LULAC just filed a lawsuit in Texas again, because what we're seeing there is a real effort and an intentional effort to suppress the voters of communities of color. And I am so proud that Vanessa Cardenas, who is our senior policy advisor, will be representing LULAC on this panel. To all the panelists, thank you for all that you do every single day to champion our communities. Thank you for your sacrifices and making sure that our voices are always represented. With that, Alejandro, I turn it over to you.
The internet and its many benefits continues to transform every aspect of our lives. It has revolutionized communications and has become the primary access point and the preferred medium for almost everything we do. And with it, access to information, knowledge, and learning like we have never experienced before throughout the course of human history. It has brought us closer together allowed us to communicate with each other regardless of geography or distance. And it has created new pathways towards greater collaboration, the ability to work from home, and for companies, access to a global workforce. That being said, the internet itself has been and continues to be transformed. In its early days, it was a static network designed to shuttle a small freight of bytes or a short message between two terminals. It was a repository of information where content was published and maintained only by expert coders. Today, however, immense quantities of information are uploaded and downloaded, and the content is very much our own. Thanks to the protections offered by Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act, which shields online platforms from certain aspects of liability from user-generated content, we are all commenters, publishers, and creators. And with that, a rise of kind of new questions and a growing tension between hate speech, free speech, and the spread of misinformation in our digital world. I sat down with Chris Lewis, CEO of Public Knowledge, Joseph Geraciu, Director of the Media and Democracy Program at Common Cause, Vanessa Cardenas, Senior Policy Advisor for LULAC, Adrian Chaboya, Director of United We Dream's Disinformation Defense Project, and Carlos Gutierrez, Policy Counsel for LGBT Tech, for a candid conversation about civil rights, digital privacy, and the present and future of Section 230. Here are some of the highlights from that conversation.
Thank you, Alejandro, for bringing us together, and thank you to HTTP for fostering this conversation, which I think is super, super timely. As you mentioned, LULAC is the largest and oldest Latino civil rights organization in the United States, and we fight every day for the civil rights of Latino communities across the country. And I think that it's really important to have this conversation to provide a little bit of context on why this conversation about this information is so important today, particularly in the context of having an election year this year, where our community is going to play a pivotal role. So as you know, Latinos already face a number of barriers when it comes to voting, be it because of the lack of information, because of language barriers, and also because our folks are very young. The average age of a Latino is like 25 years old compared to the rest of the population, which is like 45 years old. So it's a very young, in many ways, sometimes isolated community from sort of the information that we need. And add to that the layer of COVID-19, which is right now what our community is going through. And I know that all of us that are on the screen right now have read the articles about just the disproportionate impact on our community. And at LULAC, we are dealing with that every day. Hearing from our councils about the number of community members who are losing their jobs, who are losing their homes, who cannot afford to pay rent. So my point being here is that not only are we dealing with sort of the longstanding barriers that we had to voting, but now we're dealing with the public health and an economic crisis, right? That's adding to this anxiety. And now we have this added issue of disinformation around not just the election, but around COVID, and also around sort of the racial conversation that we're having. And this is having real impact on our communities day in and day out. And I think it's really also important to clarify this information is really an effort to really harm communities. It's an intentional effort to undermine our institutions, to undermine the truth, right? To the notion that you cannot believe anyone. So this information is not just something that happens. It's a concerted effort by bad actors, and nowadays driven mostly by domestic actors who are trying to create havoc and really just create mistrust, not just about each other, but about our democratic systems. So when you see it in that context, you can really understand how harmful this is for our folks. And this year, we have been at LULAC, we have been tracking this, and obviously we are very much in touch with our councils. We have over 1,000 councils nationwide in states like Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and other key states where there's a large Latino community. And what we're seeing in terms of this information are just a couple of narratives that really jump out at us. One, there's a huge amount of disinformation on vote by mail, or just the effort to create, again, mistrust about how our election system works. So there's an effort to amplify any type of information that relates to, why voting by mail is untrustworthy, right? Or why, people might not be able to trust that the voting office is going to count their voting ballots. So there's definitely a huge sort of effort to just amplify those stories that, again, seeks to create a level of distrust on whether our systems, our election systems work. The second trend that we're seeing is around socialism. And I know that this is something that, especially in a state like Florida, which is so important to this election, is where we're seeing it the most. But we are seeing, for example, these themes that Democrats are socialists, that Bernie Sanders is a socialist, and that he is influencing Joe Biden, that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a socialist, that she just wants to, her ideas want to take over government, and just this notion that socialism is taking over our country, which, as you know, is very triggering for some communities that have actually left authoritarian regimes. So this really, I think this theme of socialism really is targeted to those communities to really, in many ways, even psychologically, just take them back to the places that they came from. So it's something that we're seeing a lot online. And the last trend that we're seeing, which to me, they're all bad, but I would say to me, this is the one that angers me the most, is this racial tensions. This information. And we saw this especially around the Vanessa Guillen case. As I'm sure most of the viewers know, Vanessa Guillen was a soldier in Fort Hood, Texas, and she was murdered. And Army officials were not doing what they needed to do to find out what happened to her. But it ended up that now there's a suspect, and the suspect is African American. So around that case, there was so much disinformation that sort of sought to portray African-American people attacking Latinos. And they would use the Vanessa Guillen case as an example of that. And that connected to sort of the Black Lives Movement and just portraying the Black Lives Movement as violent, as looters, and so on and so forth. And again, just trying to drive the message that Latinos could not trust Blacks when we know that there are Afro-Latinos among us, right? So there's this notion that there's this divide between communities. And we've also seen that in the last few weeks, actually in Florida, between the Latino and the Jewish community, which again, as most of us know, there are a lot of Latino Jews among us, right? It's not like you can divide us, but these racial tension pieces are super damaging, not just in the short term, but I think also in the long term. And this, again, bad actors that are preying on fear, preying on just our vulnerabilities, it is something that it is incredibly detrimental for not just the Latino community, but I think for all communities. So the question for us is, what we can do about it. And one of the things that we have been really proud to join at LULAC has been the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, which seeks to hold Facebook accountable and to really just ensure that Facebook stops promoting hate. And there are many ways that Facebook can do that. One is just by virtually eliminating these closed groups where there's a lot of extremism and white nationalism that sort of fosters community within Facebook groups. So the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, again, is a coalition of civil rights groups, including LULAC, Bad Color of Change, ADL, the National Hispanic Media Coalition, and others. And again, our goal is for Facebook to take common sense steps to address just the racism, disinformation, and hate that prevails on its platform. And I would also just end by saying that, obviously we all have a role in stopping disinformation. one of the themes that I did not mention, but we also know that it's also super rampant in terms of disinformation online, is around COVID, right? And given sort of the disproportionate suffering that our community has experienced because of COVID, it's really just immoral to let all this disinformation about COVID and COVID cures and all this disinformation about, what we can expect from a vaccine or when and so on and so forth, to just stay on, on Facebook with all this disinformation around this issue. So that's something, again, that we're also tracking and that we need to address. But I would just end by saying that, we all have a role. We all, what we can do is to help stop the spread of disinformation by not engaging disinformation, by always flagging any type of violent content that we know exists, and also by pressuring Facebook as well as other media companies and social platforms to really do more to stop the spread of disinformation online.
Thank you all for having me here. Really an honor to be with all of you and having this discussion. My name is Adrian Reina Chaboya, and I live in Seattle, Washington. I'm from Monterrey, Nuevo León. I grew up undocumented outside of Houston, a little afraid, but once I left and went to school in Austin, Texas, I found my calling and came out as undocumented and queer. And that's where my journey began. And, I've been working with immigrant communities ever since I was 18 years old. And I'll tell you one thing, I have seen it all. Immigrant communities rely on social media to stay connected, to get their news, to talk to each other, whether it's group chats on Facebook groups. And I know me and my friends and my colleagues at United We Dream have been dealing with disinformation since day one, spreading news about fake raids, whether it happened or not, fake Know Your Rights graphics that some white supremacists authored and put on Reddit, and then they started to share all over the place. And having to navigate life, always having to think, is this true or not? Now that instinct is not really there, right? And that is why this time around, when we began to notice that in these same spaces that folks created groups to share trusted information among each other about what's happening, we began to notice that so many of our members were being exposed to content that was straight up just fake, false, authored content that people would just come across on social media. Now, United We Dream is a national network. We have over 50 affiliates across the country, over 500,000 members all over the country. And folks have, access to their devices. We know that folks are on social media. Most of the folks that we work with are young people in high schools, in colleges, workers. All of these conversations are also happening offline where disinformation spreads. So we thought, what better way for us to start ensuring that people have good information and actually defeat disinformation by circulating good information and create counter narratives that people can engage with. Obviously, the challenge that comes with that is that, as we all know, conspiracy theories and disinformation spread so quickly because they sound very explosive and novel, right? And so we really have had to lean on the expertise of our own community to be creating the content that we distribute, to them to be the ears on the ground and be hearing what are the narratives that we need to overcome. As Vanessa shared, you put it just right. There's so much at risk for immigrant communities right now, COVID being one of them, to civic participation and just civil society overall, right? Like immigrant communities, whether you are a voter or not, if you're undocumented or you're a citizen, the truth is that you are still in communication with you're part of the fabric of society. And so we're only as strong as our weakest link. So ensuring that groups of undocumented people across the country have access to information, they are having conversations with their kids who are voters, right? If they're older immigrants, and ensure that any misinformation or disinformation relating to the voting process, that they actually have the right one and that they have consumable content that they can share around that. And, we launched this effort. It's called Reclaim the Web. You can find it online on the United We Dream website. But the thing that's really important to us here is we know that this information is not just going to go away this election or because of the effort that we're doing in 2020. It will continue. And that is why this is a social media regulatory issue that all of us have a role to play. And the truth is that we are seeing the impacts of a product that was designed, right, to ensure that people keep coming back to social media platforms and just stay in front of their devices. Sure, but look at the consequence that's having. Let's look at the consequence that's having here in the US, but also for our members. We come from countries where these same products and platforms have caused tremendous amount of civil unrest that have created serious political turmoil that caused people to migrate. And I just want us to look at the situation in Myanmar and everything that happened there. What does accountability look like? What does accountability look like that a US-based social media company created a product that allowed for the spread of mass disinformation that caused an impact on migration patterns, yet we are more and more, the world continues to become more and more restrictive on immigration. This is just not right. The fact that this information is leading to costing lives means that we all have a role to play. That is why United We Dream has stepped up in this way. We know that we walk in the path that so many have, marked for all of us to walk through. But we are not shy of saying it how it is. Someone and social media tech companies need to be held accountable to this. We all need to be doing our role to ensure that our communities are developing a different relationship to technology because lives are at risk here. And that is why we're doing this.
Section 230, I think, has been crucial, not only for the LGBTQ plus community, but for a lot of minority communities in terms of giving us a voice. I think if we go back to when Section 230 was passed, back with the Communications Act in 96, we had a very different landscape for LGBTQ plus individuals. To steal from Senator Wyden, one of the writers of the safe harbor provisions of Section 230, Section 230 provides intermediary internet companies with a shield and with a sword in order to kind of control content. And the shield is that internet companies are not liable for the speech of third parties on their site, which is what allowed chat rooms and kind of conversations to flourish online. And the sword part of it is that the companies will have the ability to moderate and to filter content without incurring liability as well. The sword part of this is what allows companies to actually take steps to control hate speech and to remove extremist groups online without having to do kind of a fair balance analysis. So there's two sections of that law that really kind of helped the LGBT community at its inception. So back in 96, there was not a lot of outlets for LGBT people. And we are one of the few minorities that can be discriminated even at home. So a lot of racial minorities and a lot of other minorities have a safe space to go home to, and they can talk to their families about discrimination. But the LGBTQ plus community can actually be discriminated as badly or worse in their own home as they can be outside of their home. So the internet provided a lifeline for LGBTQ plus people to be able to connect with other people, to be able to find information about community and like-minded individuals, to find medical information. It also allowed people in the community to set up their own websites, to set up their own pages of community and their own pages to disseminate information. And what Section 230 allowed these websites to do is to be able to engage in a system where they can set up, have conversations about LGBTQ plus issues without fear of being kind of discriminated against, being sued for defamation, or also with the ability to block content on their sites that was hateful, that was directed towards them, gays go to hell kind of stuff, could be blocked because of Section 230 without liability. So Section 230 I think was crucial in allowing some of these communities to kind of take off and to kind of grow in an environment that allowed them to do so in safely. So, for example, if you have a group or a site for survivors of abuse by Catholic priests or by Boy Scout leaders, people could go and share their experiences in this group. And the website did not have to take down their conversation for fear of being sued for defamation by someone that was being discussed. I think that Section 230 has been crucial to the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of being able to post about police brutality without fear. If there was no Section 230, defamation claims might be preventing a lot of websites from posting some of the testimonials that were on there for fear of defamation lawsuits. A lot of the comments and the hashtag #MeToo movement, I think, would not have been possible without Section 230 and fear of defamation when victims came out and stepped out and spoke against people who had abused them online. If there was a Section 230, somebody could have sued Facebook for a survivor of such abuse to be able to post that on there. And my fear is that as we talk about Section 230 and as we talk about viewpoint restrictions, the danger we run into is who's controlling the viewpoint and who's controlling the restrictions. So do I trust the Department of Justice right now to control what is a reasonable viewpoint? I do not. Alarmingly, Senator Cruz, when he was talking to Mark Zuckerberg about Section 230, talked about how Section 230 was designed to be a politically neutral law. That is absolutely not the case. The whole point of 230 is that you don't have to do that. And when you have somebody like Ted Cruz and Bill Barr from the Department of Justice talking about politically neutral laws for a minority community, the LGBTQ community who has been discriminated in the past, that raises a lot of alarms. We're usually not on the winning end of viewpoint restrictions. So when we talk about viewpoint restrictions, when we talk about politically neutral, when we talk about changing 230 to limit speech, I go back to the question of who's making the decision of what speech is adequate. Because if you want to talk about illegal speech, if you want to talk about these kind of issues, all I can do is point to Russia, where Vladimir Putin passed propaganda laws that said that if you promote quote unquote LGBT content online, that's illegal and you can go to jail. So speech, again, is in the eye of the beholder. And the reason that these laws are coming up now, and the reason that the executive order that Trump passed happened the day after Twitter fact-checked him on one of his tweets, does not give me a lot of confidence that the intent of these laws is for neutrality. It is to suppress speech. It is to elevate speech that the people who are passing these laws want to be heard, not to increase the viewpoint across the community. So I think 230 is an important weapon for marginalized voices to be able to be on site and not be discriminated against.
We're a nonprofit, Washington-based group that advocates for an open internet, advocates for free expression online, advocates for affordable access for everyone to communications online. And because of that, we've been working since our inception, about 20 years ago. We've been working to protect Section 230 because when it was created created to help promote free expression, to promote free speech online. And I can't agree more with what Carlos had to say. The law was there to ensure that the companies that were nascent companies, we didn't have dominant digital platforms, and we had these nascent social media companies. Some of them don't exist anymore. Some of them have grown up to be huge. And we hope more will continue to come along, but these nascent companies needed to create a space, or were creating a space for anyone, no matter how small or how independent you might be, to speak online. And this was revolutionary in the 90s because we have to remember what media was like back then. Everyone was wowed at that time because we had hundreds of channels on cable television. And before that, we just had the 3 broadcast channels. But still, even with those hundreds of channels, average citizens, average people had to ask for permission or had to jump through hoops in order to tell their own stories, to speak in their own voice about their own communities. And the internet allowed that and allowed platforms to compete for that sort of organizing, that sort of community building online. And the unfortunate thing, and I love what Vanessa had to say. We just, public knowledge, a few weeks ago gave an award to the Stop Pay for Profit campaign, because I believe that the push that they're making and the push that others are making against disinformation, against hate speech, is critically important if we're going to be able to keep the benefits of the internet, the benefits of Section 230 that we've had since the mid-90s. Section 230 isn't the First Amendment, but you can see how it works paired well with the First Amendment, right? It has two parts that Carlos described. The sword and the shield is a great way to describe it. And with those two parts, it empowers the platform, not the government, not like Putin or other dictators. It empowers the platform to make decisions about moderation. And that's important. But I think now that we're seeing more and more disinformation, now that we're seeing more and more hate speech online, now that people are learning to use the virality of social media and the internet for bad things, we have to find ways to set standards. We have to find ways to set expectations, and we have to find ways to hold those decision makers in platforms accountable for those community standards. In old media, it happened through, there was the FCC with standards for content on broadcast. Then we saw that relax with cable, but still people had choices in the marketplace. And now that we have dominant digital platforms where people feel like they have to be on a Facebook because that's where their friends are, or they have to be in the conversation on Twitter, we need to promote the ability for the users of technology to have choices in the marketplace, to be able to choose a smaller platform if they want to. And setting these sorts of expectations for all platforms, big and small, is a big part of that.
My name is Joseph Gatacho. I'm the Media and Democracy Director at Common Cause. Common Cause is a nonprofit organization that's focused on democracy reform issues and really holding power accountable and ensuring that we have an equitable democracy that works for everyone. Our Media and Democracy program is really designed to work at the intersection of technology issues and democracy. So looking at ways we can promote open and affordable communication systems so people can access news and information and be able to engage civically, to promote independent and diverse voices in our media so people have robust access to local sources of news and national sources of news to make informed decisions about our democracy. And of course, now it's more and more looking at how do we hold social media platforms accountable, given how dominant they've become in our society and economy and democracy, and the way bad actors are really exploiting ways they can use social media to undermine our democracy through hate speech, disinformation, and online voter suppression. So to get to your question, Alejandro, about 230, I co-signed a lot of what Chris and Carlos were saying about the intent of 230 and the role of 230. It's without a question that Section 230 was intended for platforms to create a space, an ecosystem to facilitate conversation and to facilitate the free expression of diverse voices and independent voices who, as Chris was saying, had struggled to get on through traditional media. And for the most part, up until recent times, the platforms have been able to use Section 230 to facilitate a lot of civic engagement and social movement. As Carlos was saying, it was without 230, it's very unlikely that we'd be able to get a Black Lives Matter movement or a Stop Hate movement or other types of civic movements. And that's something that we need to further encourage, particularly now when a lot of our communities are being marginalized and discriminated against. But it's also clear that when you look at the spread of disinformation and online voter suppression, platforms can be using Section 230 as a way to hide behind their content moderation decisions, as a way to say, well, we think this policy that we have is okay, even though there is voter suppression that remains on the platforms. And so the question becomes, are there ways that we can move the platforms to make better decisions? And what tools do we have? Is 230 the only tool, as you were asking? And 230 as on its own can be a tool, but the question becomes, how do you reform it in a way where you don't undermine the intent behind it, the intent to create more diverse voices, the intent to facilitate more communication online? And that's a hard question. And, I don't think there have been any strong proposals out there at the moment that get to that question. So then we have to look at what are the other tools that we have? And we have to look at how are platforms really designed for bad actors to take advantage of disinformation and online voter suppression. And the first question that is pretty obvious is that these platforms collect vast amounts of data on their users. That makes it ample ground for people to target individuals, to target communities with disinformation. So privacy is definitely a tool that we can use to actually put some safeguards around content moderation. Policy provisions like preventing platforms from engaging in predatory data practices, to prevent them from engaging in data practices that allow actors to facilitate online voter suppression. The right to access, correct, and delete information is something that we need to be promoting. And now is a time when we have no privacy protections at the federal level, which makes it much easier for bad actors to go on a Facebook or a Twitter and figure out how they could use the vast amounts of data platforms have collected to spread disinformation.
A ti que te gusta soñar. Mezcla 5 libras de inspiración, 100 libras de ganas y 500 toneladas de acción. A ti que sabes lo que es más importante. Ponle ingenio y amor al gusto. Y a ti que buscas en quién confiar, añade amigos que sepan de tecnología y estén contigo. Y listo. AT&T, para apoyarte a ti y a ti. Visita att.com/a ti y a ti.
Greetings to everyone at this year's Digital Inclusion Summit. And thank you to all the members of HTTP for your leadership in ensuring that diverse voices and perspectives are not only participating in, but are at the center of the public debate over the future of privacy and technology. Technology, as we all know, continues to develop and evolve every single day faster than any of us can truly keep up with. And many of these advancements have an incredible ability to transform and improve our lives. Just think of how many of us have used Zoom or virtual learning or teleworking or online deliveries to get ourselves through the last 6 months of the COVID-19 pandemic. These kinds of advancements were unthinkable just a decade or so ago. They were the stuff of Hollywood movies, and now they're at our fingertips. But there are still many Americans who lack access to these incredible tools, with a disproportionate impact on Black, Hispanic, low-income Americans, and rural communities. That's why one of my top priorities in the Senate has been expanding access to high-speed broadband, especially at this moment of national crisis. Last month, I called on internet service providers to suspend limits and fees that come with increased broadband use, to expand coverage areas, to help close the digital divide, and give as many Americans as possible the digital tools they need to thrive in these trying times. But along with their many benefits, we must also be aware that these emerging technologies come hand in hand with some profound problems. Just consider how easily and how often technology like facial recognition can be abused to violate our right to privacy. We've already seen it used by the Chinese government in a manner right out of Orwell's novel, 1984, to surveil and detain individuals involved in protests and demonstrations, and to enslave 1 million members of the Chinese Uyghur community. And here in the United States, even as agencies like the FBI use the technology to search through databases of driver's licenses, studies have shown that Asian and Black individuals are up to 100 times more likely to be misidentified by facial recognition technology. That's severely troubling when you see the growing adoption of this technology by law enforcement entities and recognize the extent to which minorities are already over-surveilled and over-policed in this country as it is. That's why earlier this year, I joined with several of my colleagues to introduce the Facial Recognition and Biometric Technology Moratorium Act. If it becomes law, this bill would end the use of biometric technology, like facial recognition technology, by the United States government. And it would boldly reaffirm the civil liberties of every person in this country by protecting their right to live free of unjust and discriminatory surveillance by government and law enforcement. The threat posed by this technology, which is rife with systemic inaccuracy and biases, is far too great for us to stand by and do nothing. We are living through a historic moment right now in which our nation is grappling and coming to terms with systemic racism and inequality that have plagued and shaped our nation since before we were even a nation. Men and women of all ages and races have taken to the streets of city after city across America demanding change. We cannot adopt emerging methods or technologies that exacerbate these systems of inequality and discrimination or lead us down the path to being a surveillance state. And I know that all of you at the Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership understand this fact. That's why you're working hard to bring equality to this sector of our economy, because how easily it is used to deny our civil liberties. And you recognize that if we had more diversity and more inclusion in this sector, more folks from more minority backgrounds were the ones developing and writing the code for these emerging technologies, then maybe people of color wouldn't be so easily misidentified. So thank you for your work to ensure diversity and equity in the tech sector. And thank you for hosting this event as you continue to stand at the forefront of the debate about the future of technology, privacy, and our civil liberties.
Hello again, this is Brent Wilkes, and I'm not sure if you're aware, but my other hat is that I'm the Senior Vice President for Institutional Development for Hispanic Federation, which is one of the premier Latino membership organizations working with local Latino community-based organizations across the country. We have well over 200 members, and we work with a larger network of over 500 Latino nonprofits around the United States. And our goal is really to help them to accomplish their mission and do the work that they're already doing, but to do it more effectively. We do that by making grants to those organizations, as well as providing technical assistance, model programs, and support to them in whatever capacity that we can. And very excited that we've been able to have a huge impact when it comes to disaster relief. For example, we provided over $40 million in relief work to Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, additional support in excess of $10 million in the aftermath of the earthquakes there. And now that COVID-19 has really hit communities across the country, especially hard, we've provided over $14 million in funding to support Latino organizations getting through the COVID-19 emergency relief services. And so the organization is very invested in helping Latino community-based organizations accomplish their mission and to do it even under trying circumstances like we currently are in. In addition to that work, we also are very invested in digital skilling work, and we have launched a new digital skilling initiative with over 25 Latino organizations across the United States. We're providing them with equipment, with curriculum, and with, again, technical support to help them provide digital skilling services to the Latino community at a time when we know that many Latinos are unemployed across the country or are looking for new opportunities beyond the work that they're currently doing. And to do that effectively in this new economy, we would have to make sure that they have the digital skilling skill set that really helps them have a leg up and to be able to find workplace opportunities with great companies where they're located. And so we work closely with these institutions to make sure that they've got the right skill set training that fits what the employers are looking for in their areas, and we help them execute that. And we expect to be able to place close to 15,000 Latinos this year through that initiative. So without further ado, though, I want to introduce our next panel. We've got some great presenters here, again, with Alejandro Rourke and Nicole Turner-Lee, who are some great leaders to talk to us about this important issue of digital face recognition technology and how that's impacting Latino communities, especially when we look at the issue of government surveillance of our community and how even without necessarily intending to, they've created new avenues to track Latinos and to impact our ability to help our communities. For example, in some of the racial justice protests, digital face recognition technology has aided the government to negatively impact the protesters there and allowed them to, visit them with unfair judicial processes, and so we know that this technology is not intended to necessarily be harmful to Latino communities, but has had unintended consequences for Latino, African American, and many other diverse communities across the country. So without further ado, I want to introduce Alejandro Rourke and Nicole Turner-Lee to talk to us about this very important issue.
Thank you, Brent. So as we know, facial recognition technology is on the rise, and not just in law enforcement, but in schools across the country. But a new report from the National Institute of Science and Technology, which tested 200 systems and photos of more than 8 million people, suggests that its accuracy can vary widely depending on race and gender. African Americans and Asian Americans and communities of color can be between 10 to 100 times more likely to be misidentified by the technology than white people, and women specifically are more likely to be falsely identified than men. At this point, what is clear is that not all facial recognition systems are created equal. Different algorithms perform differently, but what we currently have is minimal oversight, regulations, or safeguards to ensure that facial recognition tools are achieving a tangible public good. To learn more about what's at stake for communities of color and what we should all know about these powerful tools and their potential harms, as well as their societal benefits, I invited Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee, Director for the Center of Technology and Innovation at the Brookings Institution, to our kitchen table conversations on race, technology, and the future of everything. Here are a few highlights from that conversation.
As it was mentioned, I'm Nicole Turner-Lee. I'm Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and the Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. And in that portfolio, I work on a variety of issues from digital inclusion. I have a book coming out next year on the U.S. digital divide that includes a focus on some Latino communities, as well as artificial intelligence. And my particular focus there is how do we create technologies that do not necessarily amplify or exacerbate the existing discriminations that we have? And it's important that we as communities of color really pay attention to this because technology is pretty much transforming how we live, learn, and earn. I want to say one more thing about this great organization that I have watched evolve and under this great leader is doing absolutely fantastic things. We need Latino communities to be represented in these conversations. It's really easy for people to think that communities of color have a variety of other issues they're dealing with. And they're right. Voting is one of them as we lead up to a national election. But one thing this pandemic has actually really exerted is that we have a lot at stake if we're not connected. The first line of my book is being connected matters in 2020. And I can tell you something else. It mattered before the pandemic and it's going to matter right after. So I want to make sure that people understand the context for why it's so important to have these conversations that HTTP is having because of who is going to have it if it's not us. So Alejandro, thank you for inviting me and thank you for putting up with me as I actually have been exhausted these last 7 months dealing with the digital divide. I mean, when we look at issues of facial recognition technology, I think it's really important, and we at Brookings are doing a project around this, particularly trying to lay out principles for law enforcement use of facial rec tools. I mean, we want technology to be a problem solver, right? We want technology to be used in ways that actually garner the types of efficiencies that we've not been able to achieve through human cognition. Facial recognition came out of that. I mean, what best to sort of detect and determine the identity of people but through their face? But there are challenges with that technology. I mean, on the one side, facial recognition is absolutely fantastic when we're looking for older Americans who are missing, children who are estranged or exploited. You know, the face detection allows us to age them using computer models to, in some cases, find them, you know, because they're actually used by public safety officials in ways that are for the public good. But, you know, and one other thing I want to mention, when the Boston Marathon bomber, for example, we used facial recognition technology to identify him in a crowd where we were able to identify the type of espionage that he placed upon that activity. But where facial recognition actually has some challenges is its technical accuracy. So if you know me really well and you follow me, you would know one thing about Nicole Turner-Lee is that I like to change my hair. So, sometimes it's braided, sometimes it's straight like today, sometimes it's curly and natural. I don't wear many wigs, but you might on occasion find that I might be wearing one. The bottom line is we know that facial recognition does not do a good job with identifying Black women who change their hair. And the fundamental cause of that is that facial recognition does a poor job in identifying people of different skin tones. So the darker you are in complexion, the less likely the facial recognition will be accurate in really determining who you are. And there are implications of that. The implication is not that someone will mistake me for Janet Jackson or beloved Selena. The implication is that someone may actually misidentify me as a criminal. The Congressional Black Caucus just a couple of years ago had facial recognition technologies applied to their entire populace. And out of that, a good portion of them came back as potential criminal defendants, meaning that their faces were sort of equated as mugshots to other similar faces in their system. So on the technical accuracy side, we really have a long way to go to get it right. And part of the reason we've not been able to get Black and Latina faces right on facial recognition is not because we're just so darn beautiful. It is actually related to the fact that we don't have enough people working in those fields that can contribute input towards these diverse and inclusive models. In addition to that, we don't have enough people like myself, who's a sociologist doing technology, that can talk about the sociological implications of finding out that someone that you've actually detained is really innocent. If you think about the disproportionate representation of Blacks and Latinas in the criminal justice system, and you think about the use by law enforcement of this new and shiny object to identify us for criminal cases, the likelihood is that the data that will actually pull upon will be people who are previously incarcerated, which will most likely be us, and it will overlay the technical inaccuracy, which will most likely make it wrong. And so I think, Alejandro, we have to pay attention to these things, particularly if it gets into the hands of the wrong actors. Technology in and of itself is flawed. It's flawed because the very design of it takes into account the external world in which it's deployed. And right now, as you've mentioned, we're dealing with a host of racial inequality challenges, a host of challenges that have been brought on by this administration. And all of that feeds into technologies that by themselves do not discriminate, but rather the people who design it may have unconscious bias that feeds into it, as well as the context in which it's deployed. So facial recognition for criminal justice use may also be inherently flawed just because structurally it's never favored Black and brown people.
En la clase de hoy va a aprender cómo usar YouTube para hacer crecer su negocio.
Si yo lo puedo hacer. Puede informar a sus clientes si ha cambiado su horario comercial.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, I'm Antonio Tijerino of the Hispanic Heritage Foundation and also a member of the HTTP Advisory Board, which means I'm doubly interested in empowering our Latinx communities in the tech sector. Our focus at HHF is education, workforce development, leadership, and culture through our innovative programs like Code as a Second Language, where we're teaching 100,000 youths how to code. We also host an entire continuum in the coding space, from CSL academies to coding summits, mentoring, networking, hackathons, and other tech challenges we're trying to meet, and also placing our talent into tech jobs. That effort was challenging before COVID in terms of connectivity at schools and community centers. Now we have to work with underrepresented communities at home, virtually, where access to Wi-Fi and devices is even more critical to basic education and workforce development. This isn't about streaming entertainment. This is about basic education and opportunity. The digital divide, or as I call it, the tech equity gap, has gotten much bigger, and it's hitting our minority communities at a disproportionate rate, just like the viruses. That tech equity gap is negatively impacting our communities who are relying more than ever on the internet, not only for education, but in job opportunities, access to information, healthcare, and can even limit our ability to mobilize during this time of social unrest. Collectively, we have to meet the moment. This is not the time to be patient. We need a sense of urgency. And our most precious commodity, our K through 12 students, are one of the biggest populations that's suffering the most. The Hispanic Heritage Foundation did a national study that found that Latino students were most likely to say their grades suffered because of lack of access to broadband. Most likely to say they couldn't finish their homework because of lack of access to Wi-Fi. Most likely to use a smartphone to complete their homework or fill out college applications. We also found that teachers said Latinx parents were most difficult to communicate with because of the parents' lack of access to the internet, just to send emails and share updates about their children. It was not a language barrier. It was an internet barrier. And again, this was before COVID. The chances of Latinx students having both a computer and high-speed internet access is about half of non-Latinos. Remember the summer slide where students would lose 25% of what they learned over the 2.5 months of summer vacation? Well, that slide is now falling off a cliff in terms of our students because they're going to be at least 9 months until most kids are able to get back to the classroom. And a recent study indeed found that Latinx students are at risk of falling 9.2 months behind their schoolwork. Many of our students live in rural areas, urban centers, low-income communities, border towns, and others challenged by the digital divide. Additionally, the future of work is dependent on how quickly we can get everyone connected to broadband. If this digital gap persists, studies show that it will have a negative consequences on 76% of Black people and 62% of Latinos being shut out or underprepared for 86% of US jobs by 2045. And then you wonder why Black and Latinos are so dramatically underrepresented in tech jobs. Mystery solved. But now we need to solve the problem. I'm grateful to HTTP and its members and supporters because they understand that our community's ability to connect to broadband for job skills training in the digital age is inextricably linked to our economy, just as it is with our education. We are proud to partner with HTTP for this year's Digital Inclusion Summit to have these important conversations about the future of work. The impact of COVID and its impact on jobs, the economy, and other challenges have raised important questions about the nature of work, the support systems available if we are unable to work or retire, and the skills that we need to succeed in today's job market and in the jobs of the future. As we consider these questions, technology and access to broadband continues to play a central role in determining who has access to flexible remote work opportunities, access to an always-on medium to learn new skills and apply for new higher-paying jobs, and who's able to benefit from our digital economy. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted our economies and societies and has increased that tech equity gap I had mentioned between the most privileged and the most vulnerable, leaving us all to answer the question, how can we rebuild the world of work in a way that gives people more opportunities than before and decreases inequalities? Now I'm happy to turn the mic over to HTTP Executive Director Alejandro Rourke for a fireside chat with Ariane Jarro, CEO of the Workers Lab, where they will explore the future and dignity of work and how together we can build an inclusive and empowered workforce of the future. And also thank you for your leadership, Alejandro, and your tireless work on these issues.
Thank you, Antonio. As the nature of work changes, so has the workplace. Work as we have known it in every sector of the American economy is being disrupted by new and emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, robotics, and big data. Traditional employment is beginning to look a lot more like gig work, with unpredictable work schedules and more uncertain working conditions and compensation. These changes have broad implications that are fueling deep economic anxiety that's only magnified by deeply embedded structural inequalities. What's worse is that as today's labor market continues to change, our workforce policies and systems that are supposed to support workers have failed to keep up with the changing nature of employment and employer-worker arrangements. Many types of workers are affected by these seismic changes, from the creative professional working gig to gig, to the retail or restaurant worker the home care worker who is negotiating a price and availability with customers through an app, even the construction worker or the long-haul trucker who is worried about a future of driverless vehicles. But these changes are not impacting everybody equally. Women, people of color, immigrants, and people with disabilities disproportionately bear the brunt of potential displacement, exacerbating inequality overall. To better understand the dynamic nuance needed in order to effectively promote better policy solutions that address the real-world needs of today's workers, I sat down with Adrián Haro, CEO of the Workers Lab, and Alejandra Montoya Boyer from the National Association of Counties. Please join me as we watch some highlights from those conversations.
My name's Adrian. I'm the CEO at the Workers Lab, where our purpose is to give new ideas about increasing power for workers a chance to succeed and to flourish. I started at the Workers Lab in 2017 as our managing director, supporting the vision of our founder, Carmen Rojas. And really at that time, the Workers Lab was a fiscally sponsored project of a larger foundation. Super scrappy startup. We didn't know if it was going to go anywhere or become a thing, and it has. And so over the last 3 or so years have really worked to build this organization from scratch. Everything from building out our terrific programs to a budget, a benefit strategy, payroll, all of that stuff, which is a lot of work. Anybody who's ever started anything knows that building something is a lot of luggage, let me tell you. But the one thing that, but I've never gotten tired, right? The one thing that I love about this job is that I get to do it all in service of making the lives of working people better. And that is really special to me, mostly because of where I grew up and how I grew up. So I grew up on the east side of Los Angeles. I actually just moved back here. It's a little town called Pico Rivera, California. And Mexicans live here. Mexican Americans live here. And at a very young age, I had the example through my mother of service and was like pretty intense about service as a kid. And it never left. It is the reason why I have done everything you just read about in my bio and continue to do today in service of making the lives of working people better. My passion for this stuff, this issue really does come from my parents, both immigrants from Guadalajara, Mexico. My dad was a janitor for most of my life, and my mom was a seamstress. And we always had everything we needed, right? But I knew that it took a lot, and they worked really, really hard to make sure that I had what I needed. And so I don't take that for granted at all. And I think about that almost every day in this job when I'm thinking about how best to serve all of the workers that you talked about in your intro, which, as you know, given the global pandemic, are experiencing a really undignified amount of burden and pain at this moment. Our purpose is to give new ideas about increasing worker power a chance to succeed and to flourish. And if you think about that purpose, what it's really premised on is the idea that there isn't enough innovation happening in service of working people, and in particular, low-wage working people, largely of color, right? And so we give new ideas for them and from them a chance. And we do that primarily as an intermediary funder through 2 core programs. The first is our signature program called the Innovation Fund, which is a grant competition that we host 3 times a year, really to like put out a big call and say like, what is out there, right? To sort of cast a super wide net around new ideas and innovation taking root all over the country in service of working people. We throw those ideas through a competition and then we fund them. The second programs, like you mentioned, Alejandro, are these design sprints that we do. We started doing them in partnership with Google. Indeed, the design sprint methodology is something that came out of Google Ventures. And so it's essentially a process to get a product to market, a tech solution to market very quickly. And so we've taken that methodology inside the Workers Lab and have applied it to a social change goal, building a piece of tech that aims to serve the purpose of making people's lives better. We've done that last year. Our first one, we did it on creating the first of its kind sort of emergency cash platform to serve gig workers. We did that pre-COVID. And then suddenly COVID happened. And as you might imagine, given the sort of focus on emergency cash, the learnings from that design sprint became really important. And the technology became really important, right? How do you use technology to serve workers in ways that we've never had to serve workers before? And we were really fortunate to be able to lean on all of those learnings. I mentioned the Innovation Fund. Inside, more like I love the programs, but what I love the most about working here at the Workers Lab is our values. Really, we are a majority, first generation, person of color, queer organization. And while, that's really important, it sounds super cool, but it's really, really important for two reasons. First, it sort of disrupts the notion of who's typically equipped to do innovation, right? As we see it, it is not a white tech bro in the Silicon Valley. In fact, 74%, the vast majority of the people that we give money to, the innovators on the ground, are people of color, and very specifically women of color. So we wear that with a badge of honor because it's important. It's important that we show employers, policymakers, public sector leaders, folks in the social sector, who's best equipped because of their proximity and because of their lived experiences as Latinos or as other communities of color, who's best equipped to actually solve problems in this country. And as we see it, it's people who look like me and you. In terms of how we got here, the great debate, right? But like for me, it's really personal, right? Like my parents, I mentioned, they're in their late 70s now. My parents came here at a time when we as a country were truly committed to show what dignity while working looked like, right? That job of the past where like you got a job and you had health benefits and you could go on vacation for a week, you had health insurance, right? It's not always the story you hear now, right? But that's how it was here. That was the deal when you got here and worked here by and large in and around the 1970s. And as I see it, that's when things started to change, right? Choices were made by people in power that really started to close off opportunity for working people. And those choices have, I don't need to say this, but like have adversely affected Latinos and other communities of color in really deep and longstanding ways. And so I believe how we got here was a series of choices. The first was about corporate greed, right? Leaders of corporations began to untether their fates as a business with the fates of their workers, right? Fractured it. The second choice, as I see it, was about the role of our government. Politicians, corporate leaders, academics chose to advance what I believe was an aggressive project to delegitimize the role of government in this country. I went to college on a Pell Grant, right? My whole life, I would not be here if it wasn't for government. I believe deeply in its role. The third choice, as I see it, was about one, to decimate labor unions. Worker power was sort of begun to see as like a liability, right? And so 30% of working people were members of unions in the 1960s. That was 18% in the 1980s, 14% in the early 2000s, and today barely 10% of working people are members of unions. So what were we left with because of all of that, right? The mass globalization of our jobs, of American jobs, wage stagnation, a really big steep decline in organized labor, which has contributed, there was a time, Alejandro, when work in this country was seen as a vehicle for participation in our democracy, right? And certainly it is no longer, that is no longer the case. And that decline in labor union membership, I think, has contributed largely to that. And I'll wrap by just saying that, like, if I think that how we got here was a series of choices that were, let's just give them anti-worker choices, then certainly it's time to make new choices. And to get to the last part of your question, how can we do that? How do we interact with sort of actors, people in power across industries and sectors? Our role is to give those folks proof. By funding the work that we fund, even if it's a little bit, that things can look and be different in this country as it pertains to our economy, as it pertains to how workers live in this country. Like I said, then that's like a nice tie-in to the purpose, right? And so we work every day to give new ideas a chance, and then to share the learnings from those ideas with all of those folks that you mentioned in your question.
I think one of the challenges is that the future of work has like a very specific narrative talking about automation and artificial intelligence, like the robots are coming for our jobs, and they're displacing workers, which is partially true. That's definitely not true. But really the future of work is getting at a much bigger picture that work, the nature of work, how we define our workplaces is changing. And that's true for many reasons, because of demographic shifts, because of now with the pandemic, the increase in remote work opportunities, and just a lot of different things that are shifting the way that work happens in this country and globally. And a part of that means that we are dismantling or a lot of our protections for workers need to change with it. The policies that we have in place for traditional workers just aren't enough when we're seeing so much change in workplaces right now. And so what that means is we need to ensure, proper worker protections, proper opportunities for wages and incomes that are livable, benefits that are necessary that come along with our employment or are disconnected from our employment, and really just to ensure that that jobs and work allow for economic dignity in the way that we reimagined that in the New Deal and in the 30s and 40s. We're going through another transformation now that our policies need to play some catch up with our workplace cultures. We have these labor protections born out of the New Deal in the 30s and 40s, and I think back then we never would have been able to dream the type of economy we have now, with obviously with the internet and with automation, artificial intelligence, but also with the dismantling of a lot of the protections that came with the New Deal, and with more and more people being forced into the gig economy and into non-traditional work that ensures that they're not protected. They don't have wage or minimum wage is an example, and when 50% of our workers are going to soon be classified as non-traditional gig workers, and they don't have the protections, they don't have the benefits that come with traditional employment, our economy is definitely going to be on a long road to recovery, both from this pandemic, but also just as we look at the transitions coming from the future of work. I mentioned benefits because one of the other federal policies that needs to be considered in a new administration comes from benefit portability, or just a modernization of our benefit systems. So one of the things that the Biden-Harris administration has talked about is innovative ideas around disconnecting our benefits to our employment. So much like Obamacare did with healthcare, there are ideas and innovative practices coming out of how to ensure that workers have other types of benefits like retirement savings, paid family leave, flexible spending accounts, all of the different benefits that come with traditional employment. There should be similar opportunities, maybe a federal marketplace. Certain states already have marketplaces that are similar, where someone could buy into those different the different benefits that they need. At the end of the day, the federal government is going to be the make or break for a lot of these protections. We need to see a massive transformation in our federal protection systems for workers. And a lot of these changes really do have to come from the federal government. State and local governments also play a huge role. States oversee a lot of the workforce, states and local governments actually both oversee workforce development boards, education systems, and a lot of the reskilling and retraining that'll have to happen as people move through different jobs at a newer and faster rate than before. People don't stay in jobs for 30 years like they used to. And so having lifelong learning opportunities, reskilling, retraining opportunities, states and local governments really oversee a lot of that. They get funding from the federal government through things like through WIOA and other federal grant opportunities. But the other thing is our infrastructure needs to play a lot of catch up. I'm sure the Digital Inclusion Summit will include conversations like broadband access and digital equity. But if local governments aren't able to provide their residents the infrastructure like broadband access, education access, community college, post-secondary educational opportunities, then we're not really going to be able to see the required pieces for workers to be able to continue into this new economy. As digital inclusion advocates, I think it's really critical that, one, we're just getting the voices of our communities and our stories told. At the end of the day, Congress, they're responsive to us and our needs, and if they don't know what we need, they can't do their jobs. And so just telling our stories, ensuring that people really understand what gig workers are, who they are, what they're really doing. I think there's some false narratives. For example, I think some people think that it's just people with a side hustle so that they can get their startup going, or it's, folks fresh out of college that are wanting to become artists or actors, and they're using this as supplemental income. But for a lot of people, that's their sole income, and it is necessary to be able to pay for fundamentals like housing, food, raise their kids. I mean, we're pushing more and more workers, particularly low-income workers, into these positions, and people really need to understand it. So there's the piece of just telling our stories, and particularly for communities of color, for Latinx communities, for Indigenous communities, like we just gotta be ensuring that our policymakers know who we are. The second piece of that is we need to make sure that Congress is responsive to us as people and not just to big corporations. That's much harder or easier said than done. And at the end of the day, some of these big companies have billions and millions and billions of dollars to put behind lobbying efforts and campaign efforts. But if we can get op-eds drafted, if we can get some digital campaigns going, I mean, we've seen social media transform how campaigning works. And so using those tools to our benefit to be able to advocate for the policies that we want to support and see enacted. And lastly, just like holding our leaders accountable when our leaders fail to be responsive to our community's needs. We need to be able, including our democratic, to put a partisan spin on it, but including the leaders that we elect or that we support, we need to be able to hold them accountable when they're not doing enough to support the communities. And worker protections is a fundamental issue right now amongst a million other issues, but we will not have a successful economic recovery if we don't include worker protections for gig workers. It's just a fact. There's too many people in this new economy that if they're not included in the recovery, our economic recovery won't be successful.
Hi, it's Alejandro again. This concludes the program for our first and hopefully yearly Digital Inclusion Summit. I want to take this opportunity to extend a heartfelt thank you to all of our partner organizations, our underwriting partners, the leadership of HTTP's CEO Roundtable, and all of you for sharing your afternoon with us. The COVID-19 global health crisis has taught us all that almost every facet of American culture is insufficiently prepared to meet our growing digital needs. As the burdens of the pandemic continues to fall most heavily on those most historically disconnected, it is up to us to continue the conversation and to work with policymakers, regulators, internet service providers, and online platforms to work collaboratively to build new solutions in order to achieve an inclusive tech future that serves all people equally. Today's program which is the jumping off point to establish a shared understanding of what's at stake for our communities, but it is also a call to action to become a part of our country's connectivity story. We can no longer look away from the role that the internet plays in our lives. The internet is an essential and principal building block for success. COVID has served as an inflection point for action, but it is up to us working together to establish a bipartisan, cross-sector, collaborative, and unifying strategy that prioritizes our values of connection, inclusion, representation, safety, and fluency, and that establishes a consistent and reliable regulatory framework to ensure that everyone, regardless of race, ability, income, gender, orientation, faith, country of origin, has access to and can benefit from our 21st century digital economy. Tech and telecommunications policy gives us the opportunity to build the inclusive infrastructure of the future and is the best pathway towards achieving a new era of shared prosperity. I invite you all to stay connected by following @HTTP_policy on Twitter and Instagram. And I hope to see all of you at the live after show starting immediately after the simulcast. So until then, until we see each other again, whether it's in person or online, remember to get connected, to tune into the conversation, and to speak out, because the future needs our help. Thank you again for joining today's program, and see you next time.